A chilly June morning in 2012 began with an unusual disturbance on Willow Lane in Rutland, Vermont. 5 unmarked police cars quietly pulled up in front of a modest 2-story wooden house in the middle of a peaceful neighborhood. Neighbors peeked through their curtains as officers in tactical gear fanned out and formed a perimeter around the property. Inside, 81-year-old Frank Dalca was making his morning coffee, a habit he had kept for nearly 5 decades as the well-known former owner of the local diner, the friendly neighbor, and the patriarch of a long-established Rutland family. At exactly 7:14 a.m., a sharp knock echoed through the house. Frank Dalca, Vermont State Police. We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the 1960 disappearance of Elsie Warren. The officers later described how the old man's hand trembled slightly as he set down his coffee cup, yet his face remained unnervingly calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment for more than half a century. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss the latest cases. The winter night of 1960 draped Rutland, Vermont in a thick blanket of snow, mixed with freezing fog. Wind from the Green Mountains swept down and made the air feel almost frozen in place. The few streetlights along the narrow road cast dim, hazy pools of light onto the white-covered pavement. The Maple Arch Diner, located on the edge of town, was getting ready to close after a long day. Inside, the lingering warmth from the kitchen and the faint smell of grease still hung in the air as 17-year-old Elsie Warren finished her evening shift. She took off her apron, folded a few cleaning towels, quickly said goodbye to the remaining staff, and headed toward the back door, the exit employees usually used after closing. The door swung open, a blast of cold rushed in, and the snow was falling much heavier than it had been earlier in the evening. Wind whipped across the back lot, blurring the faint glow from the old incandescent bulb above the door. A few late-leaving customers caught sight of Elsie crossing the parking lot, clutching the collar of her coat and walking faster than usual to escape the wind. They only managed to recognize her familiar silhouette disappearing into the swirling snow. They couldn't clearly see which way she turned. Within minutes, her footprints and any trace of movement were completely erased by the fresh layer of snow. As time passed, and Elsie still hadn't come home, her family grew anxious. They called the Maple Arch Diner to confirm she had left, then went outside to search the neighborhood, following the familiar route she took from the diner. They shone flashlights into backyards, checked porches, knocked on the doors of a few neighbors who were still awake, and asked if anyone had seen her on the road or noticed her stopping anywhere along the short walk home. No one had any additional information beyond the fact that she had left the diner as the weather turned worse. The wind grew stronger, carrying the damp smell of snow and a heavy silence that made it impossible to track even the smallest clue. The family searched for hours, hoping she had simply taken shelter somewhere, but every possible location was empty. Anxiety quickly turned to fear as the night wore on with no news or sign of Elsie. With no other options, they contacted the Rutland police to report her missing. Just minutes later, while snow still covered the roads and wind lashed against the eaves, Sheriff Alvin Huxley received the call from the Warren family and immediately drove to their home to take the initial report. Their small house sat on a quiet street not far from the Maple Arch Diner. Warm yellow light spilled weakly onto the snowy front yard in 2 faint strips as he climbed the steps. Inside, the Warren family sat huddled in the living room, their faces tight with worry after hours of fruitless waiting. Huxley opened his notebook and began gathering basic details about Elsie. Her work schedule that evening, the usual time she left after her shift, the route she always took home, a short residential stretch with no dangerous areas or dense woods. The family said Elsie never took a different route and had no habit of staying out after work. He recorded her description that night, what she was wearing, the shoes she had on, her recent health, and her mood in the days prior. Everything they provided indicated she had no reason to leave town or intentionally cut off contact. Huxley walked through the house and checked Elsie's bedroom. The bed was untouched. Her heavy winter coat and regular cold weather boots were still hanging in their usual spot. Personal items were neatly arranged on her dresser. There was no sign she had packed or left voluntarily. From this, he made a preliminary conclusion that there was no evidence Elsie had left of her own accord. He then asked about relationships, close friends, recent changes at work, and her emotional state lately. The family said there were no notable conflicts, no signs of personal problems or complicated relationships. This further supported the initial assessment that Elsie's disappearance was not due to anything voluntary on her part. Huxley systematically wrote down every detail, trying to pinpoint the last time the family had seen her before she left for work and when they first became concerned. He reviewed her schedule within the family, things she had planned for the next day, reminders she had left that morning, all of which showed she had no intention of breaking her routine. After finishing the information gathering at the house, Sheriff Huxley gave his initial assessment that the case needed to be treated seriously. The bad weather, the late hour, and the sudden disappearance contained too many unusual elements. He decided the next step was to examine the last place Elsie had definitely been seen, so he planned to visit the Maple Ark Diner first thing the next morning, to assess the scene and determine if anything unusual had occurred when she left. As the family tried to stay calm through the heavy winter night, Huxley left the small house carrying the first notes of a case his professional instinct told him would not turn out to be a simple runaway. Early the next morning, Sheriff Alvin Huxley arrived at the Maple Ark Diner while the sun was still hidden behind gray clouds and the thick snow from the previous night blanketed everything. He parked in front of the main entrance and stepped into the space that still smelled of grease and dampness, a place that only came alive at night. Before starting his survey, Huxley spoke briefly with the morning shift employee to confirm the diner's condition after closing the night before, then began examining each area in order. He stood at the service counter where customers ordered and staff constantly moved, inspecting the tablet tops, under the counter, and the space behind the cash register. There were no signs of disturbance beyond normal diner activity. Cups, plates, and cleaning towels were all in their proper places. Huxley noted that if any incident or struggle had occurred in this area, it would have left some mark on the floor, but everything was clean except for a few snow-smudged tracks from customers' shoes the previous night. Next, he moved into the kitchen through the small swinging door. The kitchen was large and full of equipment, but neatly organized, with clear sections for different cooking tasks. Huxley scanned the floor, corners, the area where sharp tools were kept, and even checked the kitchen trash for anything unusual or strange stains. Nothing stood out beyond the previous day's food scraps. He recorded that the kitchen showed no indication the victim had encountered trouble there. From the kitchen, Huxley walked down the narrow hallway that led to the back door. The route employees used to come and go. He noted the hallway's width, the number of steps it took to traverse it, and the position of the wall-mounted light to determine whether someone passing through at night could easily be blocked or ambushed. The hallway was quite narrow, barely wide enough for two people to pass, and lit only by a single old bulb. Though nothing unusual lay on the floor, the secluded nature of the passage made Huxley take mental note. He then pushed open the back door. The door was heavy. Its hinges creaked slightly, and it opened more slowly than a frequently used door would. Huxley opened and closed it several times, noting the friction and concluding that anyone passing through would make enough noise to be heard by someone near the kitchen, though not loudly. He carefully recorded that detail because it related to timing and the possibility that someone heard or saw the victim leave. Stepping outside, Huxley stood in the back lot, a narrow strip of ground that stretched to an old wooden fence, where even daylight couldn't erase the cold emptiness under the thick snow. The ground beneath his feet was completely undisturbed. No footprints, no drag marks, no mechanical traces. The previous night's snowfall had leveled the surface, erasing any chance of tracking movement. He surveyed the perimeter, a metal trash can placed against the building wall, a drainage pipe buried under snow, a few old scratches on the concrete near the door, but nothing recent. A little farther, The fence separated the diner lot from the dark tree line at the edge of town, half buried in snow. There was no obvious gap in the tall section of fence, meaning anyone crossing it would have had to climb over frozen wood, an action difficult to do without leaving marks, unless snow immediately covered them afterward. Huxley crouched and tapped the snow with his stick to test its depth, confirming that continuous snowfall overnight had been heavy and long enough to obliterate everything. He walked along the back wall, checking side doors and storage room windows, but all were securely closed with no signs of forced entry. In the corner of the lot, a dirt path led toward the dark woods, but it was completely buried, making it nearly impossible to determine direction after leaving the back door. Huxley stood at the spot witnesses said they last saw Elsie. From that vantage point, the view was just an endless white expanse. He mentally mapped every direction she might have taken across the lot to the main street, along the row of houses behind, or back toward the woods. None showed any clear sign. The absence of footprints meant that if Elsie had encountered trouble or changed direction immediately after exiting, everything had been wiped clean within minutes by the heavy snow. Huxley went back inside and re-examined the entire space from the back door through the kitchen to the service counter to ensure he hadn't missed anything that could help the investigation. However, every area was too clean and empty to provide a concrete clue. After a final check and more notes, he had to conclude that the Maple Ark Diner was the last place the victim was definitively seen, and her movements afterward had been completely erased by the weather. This made reconstructing Elsie's final minutes the biggest challenge in the early stage of the investigation. With that assessment, Huxley decided to start with the people who knew the diner's evening events better than anyone and proceeded to take statements from the two key figures on the previous night's shift. Brothers Frank and Curtis Dalca, the owners and direct managers of the place where Elsie worked. Frank Dalca was the older brother, careful and methodical. Curtis was younger, quick, and usually worked the night shift. Huxley began with standard questions about when the victim left, her final actions, and the diner's condition at closing. Frank, noticeably calmer, said that after the last customers left, Elsie quickly cleaned up and left the same as always, emphasizing that she showed no unusual behavior and, as far as he remembered, left right after finishing the counter area. Frank placed that time fairly early, saying it was only a short while after closing. Everyone was gone. Huxley noted this as the first timeline marker. However, when he turned to Curtis to confirm the sequence, discrepancies began to appear. Curtis said Elsie did not leave immediately, but stayed in the kitchen a little longer to finish scrubbing pans and wiping the stove. When Huxley asked if Curtis remembered seeing her head toward the back door, Curtis replied that he only caught a glimpse and believed she left later than Frank had stated. This was the first notable contradiction. One said early, the other later. Huxley pressed further on the victim's demeanor when she left. Frank insisted Elsie was completely normal, showing no worry or hurry. Curtis, on the other hand, said she seemed a bit tense, quieter than usual, and avoided eye contact when passing him at the end of the shift. When asked if anything during the shift might have upset her, both said nothing unusual, but Curtis added that he heard a bumping sound from the back of the kitchen near closing time, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly when. Frank flatly denied hearing any strange noise. These small but clear differences showed the brothers were not aligned on the victim's mental state. Huxley continued with her final tasks inside the diner. Frank said she mainly wiped down tables and washed glasses, nothing outside her normal routine. Curtis remembered differently. According to him, Elsie changed the kitchen trash bag and stepped out to the back area for a few minutes before leaving. But when pressed for the exact timing, Curtis couldn't say because he was busy counting the register. This added a large question mark about the victim's location in her final minutes inside. The sheriff then asked about the condition of the back door. Frank said it was completely normal and used daily by staff. Curtis described it as slightly sticky and sometimes requiring extra force to open. A third contradiction emerged regarding regular use of that door. When asked if either had seen any strangers around the diner before or after closing, Frank said the night had been quiet with no customers lingering. Curtis mentioned seeing a red car parked outside near closing time, but since it was far away under dim light, he didn't pay attention to who was driving. Frank appeared surprised by this and said he never saw any such car. That was the fourth time their accounts diverged. Huxley kept asking about Elsie's usual route home after her shift. Frank said she always took the direct main road. Curtis said sometimes she took the back way depending on weather or to avoid strong wind. Though not a major conflict, Huxley noted it because it affected determining which way she went that night. Regarding Elsie's relationships at the diner, Frank insisted everyone got along fine, but Curtis said she had been quieter before leaving, as if something was on her mind. Huxley tried to get Curtis to specify, but he couldn't give a clear reason. After finishing the Dalca brothers' statements, Huxley saw multiple inconsistencies regarding departure time, the victim's state of mind, and details about the back exit area. However, since there was no direct evidence of suspicious behavior, he could not yet formally suspect anyone. He simply recorded all the contradictions as background data for later cross-referencing and determined that the statements from the Maple Ark Diner had to be verified with multiple other sources to clarify Elsie's final moments inside. Following that approach, Huxley continued gathering statements from others present that night, starting with the two remaining waitstaff from the evening shift. The first said she only saw Elsie in passing near closing, describing the victim as quieter than usual, but still completing all end-of-shift cleaning tasks fully. When asked if anything in particular caught her attention, the employee said that Elsie avoided eye contact and headed straight down the hallway behind the kitchen as soon as her shift ended. Another employee provided more detail, saying she heard the back door open, then saw the familiar silhouette of Elsie stepping outside into the white snow, but she couldn't pinpoint the exact time because the diner was busy with closing cleanup and people were moving back and forth. Huxley noted that this matched the family's information that Elsie had left the diner right on her normal schedule, but the inconsistency in descriptions of her mental state across statements made him take special notice. Next, Huxley called in several customers who had been present near closing time. An older regular said he saw Elsie standing near the back door when he left through the front, emphasizing that she was moving quickly and barely seemed to notice anyone. A younger customer recalled that as he walked to the parking lot, his eyes happened to glance toward the back of the diner, and he thought he saw a small figure stepping out from the rear door area, though his view was obscured by falling snow and dim lighting, so he couldn't make out a face. This reinforced the likelihood that the victim had left through the back exit rather than the main one. However, when Huxley pressed for more precise timing and the direction the figure was heading, the witness became uncertain, only saying the person was walking toward the open lot and couldn't recall whether anyone else was around the area afterward. A middle-aged woman who habitually sat near the rear window of the diner also confirmed that she saw the back door open once during the period close to closing, but wasn't sure if it was Elsie or another staff member. Though vague, this statement was recorded as another point of alignment with other witnesses regarding activity at the rear. When Huxley shifted to questions about activity outside the diner, one customer said he noticed a red Chevrolet parked on the shoulder near the empty lot behind the diner when he left. He described it as a recent year model, newer looking than most vehicles in town. He also remembered that the engine was running, but snow partially covered the headlights, so he couldn't see who was inside. Another employee vaguely recalled seeing the same car when stepping out the front door but paid no attention, assuming it belonged to a late-arriving customer. The fact that two independent witnesses confirmed the presence of the Chevrolet led Huxley to flag it prominently, since the car did not belong to any staff member according to the diner's employee list. Another customer said he never saw the red car, but while walking to the front parking lot, he heard an engine start up somewhere behind the diner. though the wind at the time made it impossible to pinpoint the exact direction. When asked if he saw anyone near the back door area, he recalled only a shadowy figure blending into the snowfall, impossible to identify by gender or build. Piecing together these scattered statements allowed Huxley to construct an initial picture of movement around the diner at the time Elsie left. The victim most likely exited through the back door, with several witnesses confirming they saw a silhouette or heard the door. A red Chevrolet appeared in the vicinity, though no one knew why, and descriptions of the victim's demeanor in her final minutes were inconsistent. Some said she seemed normal, others said she appeared tense. Although many details remained fragmented and unverified, Huxley logged everything as essential reference points for later cross-checking. He concluded the witness interviews at the diner with the assessment that the back door area was the focal point of the final minutes before Elsie vanished, and the appearance of the red Chevrolet was a lead that had to be pursued even without direct evidence. With that conclusion, Huxley left the serving area and kitchen and walked toward the back door to begin a full survey of the rear yard of Maple Ark Diner. The place, multiple statements agreed, was likely the last spot the victim was seen. He stood at the threshold, observing the ground covered in a thick, undisturbed blanket of snow, then carefully stepped down the small stoop leading outside. The concrete pad right next to the door had iced over during the night, creating a frosted surface that faintly reflected the gray morning light. Huxley walked along the rear wall of the building, where several large metal dumpsters stood. He tapped the lids with his cane to check the echo, noting that the bins hadn't been opened overnight and that snow completely covered the rims, indicating no one had touched them since the snowfall began. One bin had a small dry dent in the lid, but showed no fresh impact marks or foreign objects. When he gently lifted one lid, he found only ordinary kitchen trash in tied bags, nothing suspicious. Huxley closed the lid, marked the area as checked, and continued southward across the yard to a narrow passageway running along the wall that led to a secluded corner between the diner and a wooden fence. That passage was buried under such deep snow that the ground beneath was invisible. He pushed at the snow with his foot but couldn't gauge the exact depth. The entire surface underfoot was smooth, with no old depressions or footprints. This was clear evidence that the overnight snowfall had been heavy enough to erase any prior activity, making visual tracking nearly impossible. Reaching the corner, Huxley stopped in front of a small detached storage shed just a few steps away. Its door was secured with an old, rusted but solid chain and padlock. Beneath the chain, a thin layer of snow lay completely undisturbed. He examined the ground right against the wall, where drag marks or scuffs might appear if someone had stood or moved objects nearby. But the snow was even, with no depressions indicating recent presence. Huxley stood in front of the shed door for a long moment, noting there was no other entrance except the chained main door and one small side window that had long ago been boarded shut. He wondered whether anyone had used the area during last night's shift, but all physical signs showed the snow had remained untouched since the heavy fall began. He then moved to the far end of the yard, where a wooden fence separated the diner's property from a vacant lot that stretched toward the forest. The fence was chest-high on an adult, covered thickly with snow on top and showing extensive peeling paint. Huxley scanned its full length for signs of climbing, broken slats, scuff marks, or compressed wood, but everything was intact. He paused at one section that was slightly lower and older than the rest, a spot where someone could theoretically climb over more easily. Yet the snow cover remained perfectly even, revealing no footprints, depressions, or shapes, indicating anyone had crossed there overnight. Huxley continued examining the edge of the yard leading to the open lot. He crouched down, using his cane to lightly part the snow in case anything was buried beneath, but found only hard, frozen ground and ice, no tire tracks or slide marks. This was the area witnesses had mentioned, seeing a figure or hearing sounds from behind the diner, yet this morning there was no physical evidence to corroborate it. He noted that the snow was too perfect, meaning any movement from the previous evening had been completely erased. This prevented him from determining whether the victim had walked toward the main road circled the corner to a side alley, or headed toward the dark woods. Standing in the center of the rear yard, he tried to mentally reconstruct the area based on the statements. Elsie exited through the back door. Some saw a faint silhouette in the snow. A few may have noticed the red car nearby. Yet the yard right now showed absolutely no physical signs to verify any of it. Huxley measured the yard's width, the distances from the back door to the fence, to the shed, and to the property line to establish possible exit routes the victim might have taken. He also recorded wind speed and snowfall density from weather reports to compare against the likelihood of trace preservation. His preliminary conclusion was that the yard surface could not be relied upon to determine anyone's direction of travel during the heavy snowfall period. Afterward, Huxley surveyed the entire yard once more, checking every minor detail: doorstep edges, rear roof eaves, frozen runoff drips, or slightly higher ground that might retain marks better. Nothing yielded additional data. Everything had been wiped clean by the thick snow. Upon completing the survey, Huxley wrote in his notebook that the rear yard provided no clues about the victim's direction of travel and no indication of a second person's presence at the critical moment. The deep snow had erased all outdoor traces, forcing the investigation to pivot back to witness statements and evidence from inside the diner, the only remaining sources that might reveal what happened. With that assessment, Huxley shifted focus to Raymond Booker, the delivery driver who regularly entered and exited the diner during the evening shift, and one of the last people to see Elsie in the kitchen. He asked Booker to come to the diner for questioning that same morning, while memories were still fresh enough to cross-reference. Booker arrived, looking tired, and explained that he had made his scheduled delivery the previous night, bringing crates of supplies and kitchen items. Huxley asked Booker to state precisely when he arrived, how long he stayed, and when he left. Booker said he arrived close to closing time, placed the crates in the kitchen, and waited for Curtis to sign for them. When pressed for specifics, Booker could only estimate he arrived a little more than half an hour before the lights went out. However, when Huxley compared this to other employees' statements, who said Booker left quite late, just minutes before Elsie headed to the back door, he noticed a significant timing discrepancy. He asked Booker to walk through his exact sequence, entering the kitchen, placing the order whom he spoke to, and where he stood while waiting. Booker recalled going straight through the serving area, into the kitchen, to set the crates beside the storage shelves. He said he saw Elsie in the kitchen, but wasn't sure what she was doing because it was busy. He confirmed Curtis signed the receipt. When Huxley asked whether Booker saw anyone leave before or after him, Booker said he only remembered leaving almost right after signing and didn't notice anyone moving behind him. Yet the waitstaff insisted they saw Booker still standing in the kitchen when Elsie walked toward the hallway, creating a timing conflict with Booker's account. Recognizing the inconsistency, Huxley asked Booker to confirm whether he might have lingered in the kitchen longer than he thought, perhaps rearranging crates or double-checking something. Booker paused for several seconds, then said he might have checked the contents of one crate because he thought an item was missing, but he wasn't sure exactly when that happened. Those unaccounted-for minutes coincided exactly with the period, according to staff statements, when Elsie walked down the hallway to prepare to leave. This was the first sensitive time gap, Huxley carefully noted. Huxley then asked whether Booker went out the back door or saw anyone in the rear yard area. Booker firmly stated he left through the front as always, walked to the parking lot, and went straight home. However, one witness had positively reported seeing a tall man in a dark coat near the back door not long after Booker left. Huxley presented that description, but Booker completely denied being in that area, saying he had no reason to use the back exit and didn't even know the door could be opened from inside. Huxley did not challenge him immediately and instead continued questioning about the victim's demeanor the last time Booker saw her. Booker described Elsie as busy and focused on cleaning, recalling nothing that suggested tension or worry. This again contradicted Curtis's statement that Elsie had been quiet and somewhat tense. Huxley logged another point for later comparison. At the end of the interview, Huxley summarized Booker's timeline, arrived near closing, stayed in the kitchen a few minutes, signed the receipt, possibly rechecked a crate, then left through the front. But when placed alongside staff statements, a sizable gap emerged, roughly 5 to 10 minutes, Booker could not clearly account for, that aligned perfectly with the last moment the victim was seen in the kitchen and heading out the back door. This interval led Huxley to flag it prominently, as it fell between critical markers directly tied to the victim's disappearance. He concluded the session by recording every inconsistency in Booker's statement, especially his inability to pin down exactly when he left and where he was during those final minutes. Although the contradictions were not yet enough to formally suspect Booker, Huxley understood that his account would require further verification because it could significantly affect reconstruction of the victim's final minutes inside Maple Ark Diner. Sheriff Alvin Huxley returned to his temporary office inside Maple Ark Diner with a thick notebook of statements and began assembling a master timeline from all the testimony collected from the family, staff, customers, and especially Raymond Booker. This step was crucial to visualize precisely when the victim was last present inside the diner and to determine whether the reported events supported or contradicted one another. Huxley spread every recorded detail across the table, the last time the victim was seen in the kitchen, when she walked down the hallway to the back door, when Booker claimed to have left, when staff finished cleaning, and when customers departed. He attempted to arrange everything chronologically, using relative time markers, since no one provided exact clock times. All estimates were based on perception. From the waitstaff statements, Huxley noted that Elsie finished wiping down around closing time and moved toward the rear hallway. Customers said they saw her, or a figure, exit the back door during a window described as after the last customer left, but they disagreed on how long after. Curtis Dalca recalled the victim leaving slightly later than Frank had described, because Curtis remembered her staying in the kitchen a few extra minutes to put away tools. Frank believed she left almost immediately after finishing, creating at least a 5-10 minute discrepancy. If Frank was correct, the victim left very early. If Curtis was correct, she remained inside considerably longer. When Huxley inserted Booker's account into the timeline, the conflicts became glaring. Booker said he left close to closing time, yet waitstaff remembered seeing him still in the kitchen when Elsie headed down the hallway. If the staff were right, Booker left several minutes later than he believed. The period Booker could not account for coincided with the critical window when multiple witnesses reported unusual activity near the back door. One customer said he saw a figure emerge from the back door while he himself was leaving through the front. If accurate, the victim left while customers were still present. Yet staff descriptions placed Elsie's departure in a relatively empty diner with only a few people remaining. This made the timing of her movement difficult to pin down. Continuing to layer the data, Huxley found further contradiction regarding the red Chevrolet. Witness 1 said the car was parked near the rear lot a few minutes before he left. Witness 2 insisted he saw it when arriving at the front parking lot, not when leaving. This raised the question, did the car arrive before, during, or after the victim left? No one could say for sure. Additionally, if the engine was running as described, the sound should have carried into the rear yard. Yet none of the kitchen staff recalled hearing any notable engine noise. The gap between perception and reality left the car's placement in the timeline ambiguous. Huxley compiled everything into a provisional timeline table: closing time, staff cleanup, Booker's arrival and departure, the victim's last appearance in the kitchen, sightings of light or movement at the back door, and sightings of the Chevrolet. But when he tried to align the markers on a single axis, the entire structure warped. No two accounts matched perfectly. Some points overlapped relatively, such as the victim leaving after the last customer, but the wide variances in individual recollections prevented Huxley from establishing a clear, continuous sequence. When he cross-referenced everything, 3 central conflicts emerged. First, the moment the victim left the kitchen. Second, the moment Booker left the diner. Third, the moment the red car appeared and departed. Shifting any one of these markers by just a few minutes completely altered the sequence of the victim's disappearance. This made the timeline, too unreliable to support firm conclusions. Huxley finished noting the timeline and concluded that witness statements alone could not accurately reconstruct the victim's actions and movements in her final minutes. The accounts were not only inconsistent, but overlapped in multiple conflicting directions, rendering every assumed sequence unverifiable. Although building a timeline is a critical early investigative step, the provisional one he had created offered no clear direction, only evidence that something in the statements of those involved did not align with what actually occurred inside the diner that night. Huxley recorded his final assessment. This inconsistent timeline would be one of the biggest obstacles to determining the next investigative direction, because it was impossible to establish precisely when the victim left the diner or who was near her during those crucial final minutes. Sheriff Alvin Huxley returned to the rear door area of the Maple Ark Diner after completing the timeline construction and recognized it as one of the most critical locations to examine thoroughly, since nearly all witness statements pointed to this exit as the place the victim left the diner before disappearing. He stood in front of the old metal door, carefully inspecting its structure, hinges blackened with rust, the surrounding wooden frame showing slight swelling from moisture, and the handle worn smooth from years of use. Huxley tried pulling the door from the inside. It opened slowly, producing a distinct metallic screech that could easily be heard from the kitchen area if someone was standing nearby. He noted that any door-opening activity the previous night would have produced a similar sound, yet none of the employees' statements mentioned hearing the door open at the time the victim was believed to have left. This raised the question, did they not hear it, not notice it, or was there simply no one opening the door at the moment they thought the victim had left? Huxley continued checking the door's condition by pushing it from the outside. The door resisted weaker pulling force, indicating the hinges were loose, but not to the point of leaving a gap. He examined the bottom edge for any drag marks or scratches from something heavy being pulled across it, but there were no fresh signs, only old faded ones. When inspecting the handle, Huxley noticed it was slightly loose, but still functioned well and did not stick. This condition showed the door was still used frequently, contradicting some witnesses' claims that they rarely heard the door being opened. The level of wear and the noise it made when opened were two conflicting pieces of evidence, yet neither helped pinpoint exactly when, or if, the victim passed through this way. He then checked the area adjacent to the back door and the storage shed, which was only a few steps away. The shed stood detached from the main building, its heavy wooden door secured with an old padlock and iron chain. Huxley asked Frank Dalca for the key to inspect inside, but Frank said the key had been lost and the shed hadn't been used in weeks. Curtis added that the shed only held old stuff and nothing important. Without the key, Huxley had to note that he could not open the shed, and forcing the lock without sufficient grounds would exceed his authority in a situation that still lacked clear evidence of criminal activity. This was a decision he had to weigh in the context of a case that at this stage was only a missing person report with no proof of a crime. He examined the area around the shed door for signs of movement from the previous night. The snow cover was completely undisturbed. There were no footprints along the wall, no fresh marks on the door surface, and the chain had not been moved. These factors led him to believe the shed had no direct connection to the victim's disappearance, at least based on the data he had. Afterward, Huxley returned to the diner's back door to assess whether it could have been used by anyone other than the victim. He opened and closed the door multiple times, confirming the same level of noise each time, and noted that anyone passing through while the diner was open would have had to touch the handle directly. There were no new scratches or unusual damage around the handle area, so he could not rely on physical signs to determine whether the door had been opened recently. Examining the inside of the door, Huxley saw no signs of prying or forced entry at the lock. Everything indicated this was simply a regularly used door, with nothing unusual occurring there the previous night. At least nothing visible. However, the contradictions in witness statements made this door a major blind spot. Some witnesses said they saw the victim head toward the back door, while others only a short distance away claimed they never heard the door open. This created significant difficulty in pinpointing the exact time and who passed through it. Finally, after recording all the details about the door's structure, noise level, and frequency of use, Huxley decided the back door was not a priority for deeper investigation at this stage, as there was no physical evidence or strong enough testimony to prove anything unusual had happened there. He marked the door as area checked and temporarily removed it from the list of priority locations. However, this decision, based entirely on surface conditions and the lack of corroboration from statements, would inadvertently become one of the biggest mistakes of the initial investigation phase, because it prevented him from demanding the shed be opened immediately, from collecting additional data from that potential area, and from considering the possibility that this route could have been directly linked to the victim's disappearance in just a few short minutes. After finishing his examination of the back door and noting the major limitations in collecting traces from the exterior area, Sheriff Alvin Huxley returned inside the Maple Arch Diner to review another source of information that might help establish the sequence of events: the diner's work log. He asked Frank and Curtis Dalca to provide all records related to the previous night shift, including the shift log, duty roster, and any internal notes about employees' clock-in and clock-out times. Frank brought out a thick but old logbook with a worn spine and pages stained from years of grease and moisture. Upon opening it, Huxley immediately saw that this was not the kind of standardized record-keeping he was used to seeing in other businesses. Handwriting from multiple people was mixed together, dates were incomplete, many pages were blank, and clock-in/clock-out columns were filled in more by approximation than exact times. He reviewed the page for the previous day, which should have contained all information about the victim's final shift and those of the other employees. However, Elsie's clock-out column was marked only with a simple symbol and no specific time. The other employees' columns were similar, mostly just noting they ended shift without exact times. Huxley asked Frank why the records were so inconsistent, and Frank explained that the log was mainly used to track total hours worked, and precise clock-in/clock-out times were not strictly maintained because everyone knew each other's schedules. Curtis added that they usually filled in times all at once at the end of the shift rather than when each person actually left, which led to inaccuracies. When cross-referencing this with witness statements, Huxley realized it made timelines even harder to establish, since each person may have estimated their departure time rather than recorded the actual moment. He checked the duty assignments to see if there was any note about Elsie staying late to clean, but no page specified individual end-of-shift tasks. The log only had a general entry that clean kitchen, night shift staff, without naming Elsie or anyone else for specific duties. This made it difficult to verify Curtis's statement that Elsie stayed in the kitchen longer than usual, since there was no written data to compare. Continuing to Booker's shift entry, Huxley saw Booker's name only appeared under delivery with a note signed receipt, but no exact delivery time. This was a serious issue, because the exact time Booker was present or left was one of the key points for timeline verification. The lack of time data meant Booker's statement could not be independently confirmed by diner records. Additionally, Huxley noted that each employee recorded their clock out differently. Some added an X, some just signed, some wrote nothing. This made it nearly impossible to determine who left before or after whom. When comparing handwriting, he also noticed signs that a few entries might have been filled in after the fact, as the ink was darker and the strokes fresher than on previous pages. However, there was no concrete proof of who wrote them or when. Huxley reviewed previous days' night shift pages to see if missing clock-out times were a regular habit or unique to the night of the disappearance. He found the same loose record-keeping pattern was common, suggesting the omissions were not intentional but part of how the diner had always operated. Still, the lack of standardization made building a timeline difficult and unreliable. He also checked receipts, invoices, or any timestamp paperwork related to closing activities, but only found the last customer's handwritten bill with no timestamp from a register. The inconsistency and laxness of the work records led to a clear conclusion: the Maple Ark Diner did not maintain detailed enough record-keeping to support an investigation. The shift log provided only general information without any mechanism for verifying exact times. This meant Huxley could not determine who left before or after the victim, who remained in the kitchen, or who was present during the critical time period. All these findings made it clear that the diner's records were completely inadequate for reconstructing employee movements that night. Huxley marked the work log as a limited data source and concluded that the lack of standardized clock-out recording was the reason the entire evening's timeline remained murky, forcing him to rely solely on verbal statements for the investigation, despite their contradictions and inconsistencies. Sheriff Alvin Huxley left the Maple Ark Diner after reviewing the work records and realizing the information inside could not pinpoint the victim's actions in her final minutes. He therefore shifted focus to the exterior, specifically the route Elsie Warren might have walked home, a relatively short distance that passed through a quiet residential area before turning onto the small street leading to her family's house. That same morning after the disappearance was reported, Huxley organized a small search team of several local officers and civilian volunteers, dividing the area into sections for systematic coverage. They started from the diner's front door and expanded in both directions. One toward the main street where customers and staff usually walked to the parking lot, the other toward the shortcut the family said Elsie often used in cold weather to get home faster. However, continuous snowfall overnight had completely covered the ground, erasing all footprints, drag marks, or tire tracks. As the search team walked the main road, they gently probed the snow with sticks to check for anything buried beneath: scarves, gloves, purses, or any personal items the victim might have dropped. But from the diner to the first intersection, they found nothing except a blanket of snow, so uniform it was impossible to tell anyone had walked there before. At the turn into the residential area, Huxley split the team. One group continued along the shortest route from the diner to the house, while the other checked alleys and side paths leading to empty lots behind the houses. Despite thoroughly searching every yard, bush, and narrow sidewalk between homes, both groups found no trace of the victim. Porches, back walkways, and even covered sections showed no clear signs of movement from the previous night. The team expanded to a seldom-used dirt road that led behind a row of old warehouses and an abandoned parking area, a route the family said Elsie sometimes took to shorten the distance or avoid wind. But this area was also completely white. No footprints, no dropped items, no disturbed surfaces. All warehouse doors were closed with no signs of tampering. Nearby residents reported hearing no unusual sounds that night, as strong wind and heavy snow muffled everything. Huxley and another officer continued along the street to the Warren family home, checking sidewalks, fences, and bushes along the way. Again, the thick snow made tracing any movement nearly impossible. Even areas with overhangs or shelter, where snow accumulation might have been lighter, showed no evidence anyone had stopped or passed through. When they reached the Warren house, the team searched the entire front yard, gate, and side entrance, but found no indication Elsie had come anywhere near the property after her shift. This confirmed she had not returned home via her usual route. Huxley regrouped the team for a final sweep of intersecting areas where, under normal conditions, footprints might have lasted longer, such as tree-covered sections or steps. But the heavy, even snowfall made every surface identical, impossible to distinguish new snow from the ground beneath. After hours of continuous searching with no discoveries, Huxley noted in his log that the victim's possible walking route provided no useful data for the investigation. Every direction was buried under snow, and there were no traces of the victim's movement or anyone else's along the entire path from the diner to the house. The absence of any signs forced him to conclude temporarily that the route home could not confirm whether Elsie had left in that direction, and all assumptions about her journey lacked physical evidence. Sheriff Alvin Huxley, after completing the search of the victim's usual walking route home with no traces found, decided to expand the search to the Green Mountain Forest, a large, dense area not far from the Maple Ark Diner that was considered more likely to retain scent than the flat, fully snow-covered residential zone. That afternoon, he coordinated with the county's K-9 unit and deployed a dog specially trained for tracking people in difficult conditions. The dog was brought to the diner's back door, the last place the victim was reportedly seen according to multiple statements. Handlers presented one of the victim's personal items taken from her home for scent, and after circling and sniffing a few times, the dog began following a trail. Initially, it sniffed around the edge of the back lot, moving in a tight arc close to the building wall. Then suddenly pulled hard toward the fence, separating the lot from the open land leading to the forest. Huxley and the handlers had to quicken their pace to keep up, as the dog seemed to have a clear scent in the first few minutes. However, the deep snow slowed everyone down, with each step sinking nearly to mid-calf. When the dog reached the fence, it buried its nose in the snow, circled briefly, then led the team around the open area behind the diner and straight toward a narrow trail into Green Mountain Forest. This was the first significant indication that the victim may have left in that direction, or at least that scent remained that way. Huxley cautiously noted, however, that wind could have shifted the scent, especially in heavy snow and strong cold gusts. The K-9 team followed the dog deeper along the trail. A narrow path cut through leafless bushes to the forest edge, where the ground was completely white. Despite the soft, deep snow hindering movement, the dog stayed locked on the scent, running ahead then circling back to check patches of ground. As the team neared the forest edge, the dog suddenly stopped, lowered its head, and walked in small circles, as if losing the trail. Huxley asked the handler to back up a few meters to re-establish the scent from an earlier point, hoping to regain direction. The dog sniffed deeply, but then veered in a completely different direction before stopping entirely. This was a clear sign the scent trail had been broken. The thick, continuous overnight snow had not only hidden footprints, but diluted and erased most of the scent on the ground. This made it hard for the dog to distinguish the victim's trail from other scents carried by the wind. The handler confirmed that in areas with such deep snow, tracking was almost ineffective, especially more than 12 hours after disappearance. Nevertheless, the search team decided to push deeper into the forest edge to ensure they did not miss the possibility the victim had entered the area. They split into two groups, one following the old main trail locals used, the other fanning out left and right along the trail where terrain was obscured by low bushes and large trees. Team members probed under the snow with sticks, hoping to find personal items or any sign the victim had left behind. But snow, over a foot deep, rendered probing useless. Areas that might normally hold traces better, tree bases, large rocks, or denser sections, yielded nothing. When the K-9 team returned to the loss of scent point to try again, the dog reacted the same way, a few steps, intense sniffing, then shaking its head and circling in confusion. This reinforced that scent had been completely wiped out at the forest edge by snow and wind. Huxley ordered the search radius expanded several more miles from the edge, including low-lying areas and faint side trails. They moved deeper into denser tree cover where branches sometimes blocked snowfall and might preserve limited signs. However, checking tree hollows under large roots, narrow paths, and moss-covered rocks produced no relevant traces. They mapped the entire searched area, marking difficult-to-access spots and places to recheck when weather improved. But everything was empty. When the team returned to the starting point near the diner, after hours of strenuous searching in freezing conditions, Huxley recorded that the K-9 unit had led them to the edge of Green Mountain Forest, but lost the trail there due to excessive snow depth, rendering tracking impossible. He also concluded that, despite extending several miles into the forest, there was no evidence the victim had entered or passed through the area. With weather conditions erasing all traces, the forest became a complete dead zone, providing no physical data to guide the investigation. Sheriff Alvin Huxley, After completing the search on the edge of Green Mountain Forest, without finding any traces, returned to the area behind the Maple Ark Diner to continue checking a location that had troubled him since the initial survey. The abandoned storage shed located just a few steps from the diner's back door. This was a separate structure from the main building, constructed many years earlier and no longer in regular use. The exterior was dark, weathered wooden siding that had faded under Vermont's harsh elements. Some boards were cracked but showed no signs of recent disturbance. As he approached, Huxley examined the shed door and confirmed it was secured with an old iron padlock attached to a chain wrapped around the handle. The chain was heavily rusted in places, with flakes of metal peeling off, indicating it had not been replaced in a long time. However, the rust lay undisturbed beneath the snow. There were no marks of movement. The thin layer of snow covering the chain and the base of the door remained intact, unbroken and undisturbed, meaning no one had touched the area since the snow began falling. Upon closer inspection, Huxley saw that the ground directly in front of the shed door showed no depressions or any signs of foot traffic. If someone had stood there or attempted to open the lock the previous night, the snow in that spot would certainly have been disturbed. But at the moment, the snow surface was perfectly smooth and uniform with the rest of the yard. He tapped lightly on the door and heard the hollow echo typical of an empty shed, though the resonance did not reveal whether anything large was inside. Still suspicious, Huxley gently tugged the padlock to test its firmness. The lock did not budge and remained tightly secured to the old chain, proving it had not been forcibly handled recently. He asked Frank and Curtis Dalca about the shed key and received the same answer as with the back door. The key had been lost long ago, and they had not used the shed in weeks. Curtis said the shed only contained old, unused items, while Frank emphasized there was no reason for anyone to enter it during the previous night shift. No one in the diner confirmed using the shed on the day of the incident. When asked whether anyone outside the staff could access the shed, Curtis replied that no one had a key except the two brothers, but since they could not recall the last time the lock was engaged, Huxley understood that this explanation was difficult to verify, but not yet sufficient to broaden suspicion. Huxley stood in front of the shed, weighing the possibility of requesting to break the lock for an interior search. However, he knew that under county regulations at the time, an officer could not arbitrarily break into private property without clear evidence directly linking the location to criminal activity. In this case, all physical signs pointed the opposite way: undisturbed snow, an untouched lock, a secure chain, and no statements mentioning anyone entering the area during the time the victim disappeared. Lacking legal grounds and unwilling to exceed his authority, Huxley decided to temporarily set aside opening the shed. He noted in his log, "Shed locked, no signs of use, insufficient cause to break lock." He then circled the shed to check windows or vents. The only small window at the rear had been boarded up with old plywood long before, showing no signs of being pried, levered, or moved. The gaps around the plywood were packed solid with snow, indicating no movement from inside or out. On the other side, he inspected the roof shingles, wall edges, and the junction where the shed walls met the ground, but everything was intact with no unusual marks. Huxley concluded that the shed, at least at that moment, offered no practical investigative value, though a lingering unease remained because it was the closest structure to the victim besides the back door. He marked the shed as area checked, not a priority, and shifted his attention elsewhere. This was a decision based on visible physical evidence and the legal requirements of the time. But it also became a step that forced him to eliminate the shed from the primary investigative focus in the early stage. As he left the area, snow still blanketed the shed door exactly as when he arrived. The cold silence of the back lot convinced Huxley he had not missed anything significant there. A judgment he could not have foreseen would carry consequences for years to come. Sheriff Alvin Huxley, after removing the shed from the priority list due to no signs of use and snow completely covering any potential traces, continued expanding the search beyond the immediate vicinity of the Maple Ark Diner. Seeing that the route home showed no traces and the Green Mountain direction yielded nothing, he decided to focus on natural areas capable of concealing a body or related evidence. Lakes, abandoned wells, and the old rock quarries around Rutland. The first stop was the large body of water at Chittenden Reservoir, a major lake a few miles northeast of the diner. It was a spot frequented by anglers and campers in warmer months. But in winter, the surface froze solid, and the area was virtually deserted. Huxley coordinated with an experienced search team trained for work on frozen lakes to sweep the entire shoreline, where in theory, if the victim or her belongings had fallen through, some marks might remain on the ice before additional snow covered them. Upon arrival, the team found the lake surface completely flat and white, snow covering it so evenly that the boundary between water and land was indistinguishable without measurement tools. They probed along the shore using ice testing tools and long poles to identify any weak spots that might have been disturbed. However, the entire surface was uniform, no cracks, no depressions, no structural changes, proving the ice had not been broken the night the victim disappeared. The team also searched the wooded areas along the shore where snow sometimes accumulated less, but even there all traces had been erased by the heavy snowfall. They found no items such as scarves, gloves, or scraps of clothing. After completing the full perimeter check, Huxley recorded that nothing suggested the victim had come to or been brought to this location. Leaving Chittenden Reservoir, he moved to the second site, West Rutland Marble Quarry, an old quarry on the western edge of town that had once been heavily worked for decades before being abandoned and rarely visited. The site featured deep rock pits, slippery slopes, and many long-neglected areas, places where evidence could naturally be concealed. Huxley reasoned that if the victim had been taken there, the vast and treacherous terrain would make searching extremely difficult, yet some minimal signs might remain. When the team reached the quarry, they had to navigate rough, icy paths where thick snow and ice made movement hazardous. Along the routes down to the pits, they probed every area where the victim or objects might have fallen. Rock ledges, narrow slopes, and low spots near the entrances, yet everywhere was buried under snow with no disturbance. On higher rock faces where strong winds often blew snow away, Huxley hoped to find fabric scraps or small items, but the surfaces were clean and smooth, nothing left behind. The team also searched old haul roads once used by stone trucks. These too were completely buried under deep snow, showing no evidence of passage. During the sweep, some team members suggested checking the abandoned wells running north of the quarry. Huxley agreed, and the group moved to the marked well locations. The first well had been capped with wooden planking years earlier. The snow on the cap was flat and unbroken. The second had an open mouth, but snow had filled it nearly to the top, showing no impact marks. Shining lights inside revealed only shallow frozen snow and no objects below. The remaining wells were checked the same way, but none showed signs of anyone having approached within the previous 24 to 48 hours. By the end of the search, after hours of continuous work in brutal conditions, all priority areas were marked as yielding no evidence. Huxley stood before the vast quarry, feeling the clear frustration of every avenue blocked by snow. He recorded that the sweep around Chittenden Reservoir produced no results, the West Rutland Marble Quarry search found no indications, and the abandoned wells offered nothing to narrow the investigation. Every location the victim might have passed through or been taken to left no related traces, leaving the entire day's search effort in complete deadlock. Sheriff Alvin Huxley, after finishing the fruitless searches of lakes, wells, and quarries, returned to the sheriff's station to compile all collected data. While reviewing previous statements from diner staff and customers, a new report came in from the duty desk. A local truck driver said he had information about the night the victim vanished and wanted to give a statement in person. This was a witness who had never appeared on the list of people present near the diner that evening, so Huxley immediately arranged a meeting. The truck driver, a man in his mid-40s who worked for a Rutland freight company, explained that he had passed behind the Maple Ark diner the night the victim disappeared. His delivery route that night took him along the narrow, little-used road behind the diner that trucks could still navigate if driven slowly. When asked for a specific time, He could only estimate it happened when the diner was close to closing, but could not pinpoint the exact hour because it was very dark and snowing heavily. He remembered that as his truck passed the back of the diner, his headlights briefly swept the rear lot, and in those few seconds, he saw two figures standing close to the building wall. Due to darkness and heavy snow reducing visibility, he could not make out details, only that there were two people, one near the back door, and the other a few steps away toward the abandoned shed. When Huxley pressed for details about their movement, the driver said he did not see them moving. They appeared to be facing each other or simply standing close, but he could not tell what they were doing. He heard no voices or shouting because the truck engine and strong wind drowned out all other sounds. Huxley noted that if two people had indeed been near the back door at that time, it contradicted most staff statements that no one, except Elsie, was seen in that area before she left. Asked about clothing or build, the driver recalled only that both wore dark coats and were not particularly large, making identification nearly impossible since dark winter clothing was common in Vermont. Huxley asked whether he saw any other vehicles or headlights nearby. The driver said he saw no other vehicles behind the diner, but noted visibility was severely limited. The only vehicle he was certain of was a red Chevrolet parked in the front lot when he made his next loop on the delivery route. Asked if that car could be connected to the two figures, the driver said he could not tell because he saw no actions linking the car to the figures. Huxley explored whether the two figures could have been diner staff or customers exiting through the back. However, staff statements confirmed no one used the back door at that time, and customers almost always left through the front. The driver stressed he only glimpsed the two figures for a few seconds in his headlights, and once past, the entire area fell back into darkness with no further line of sight. When Huxley asked the driver to confirm whether the figures were close together or far apart, the driver recalled they were not far from each other, but could not say if they were interacting or simply happened to be there at the same moment. One notable point was the driver's insistence that the back lot showed no rapid movement or struggle. This reduced the likelihood of obvious foul play, yet the extremely brief observation meant the information could not rule out any scenario. Huxley considered whether the driver could estimate height or build to identify the victim as one of the figures, but the driver admitted he could not distinguish gender, height, or age. Everything was just two dark silhouettes against the white snow and reflected headlight glare. Cross-referencing this statement with timelines from staff, customers, and Booker showed the driver's account was too vague to help reconstruct events. If the two figures were part of the incident, the statement contradicted staff claims of no one being outside the back door. If it was a misperception under poor visibility, the information had no investigative value. More importantly, the driver could not confirm an exact time or identify the figures or their actions. After recording the full statement, Huxley weighed its reliability. The vague account, uncertain timing, terrible viewing conditions, and lack of direct corroboration made it nearly unusable to support any theory. Therefore, when finalizing the official report, Huxley chose not to include the statement in the primary missing person file due to lack of verification and clear evidentiary value. He kept an internal note referencing the truck driver seeing two figures behind the diner, but unable to provide identifying details or related actions. Thus, the statement offered no direct support to the investigation at that time. Sheriff Alvin Huxley decided to bring Raymond Booker in for a second interview after compiling all data from other witnesses, including the truck driver's account, inconsistencies in staff statements, and the unclear initial timeline. Booker arrived at the station, visibly more tense than during the first interview, and as soon as Huxley began questioning, changes in his story became immediately apparent. This time, Booker no longer confidently stated the time he left the Maple Ark Diner. When asked to recount the evening sequence, he no longer said he left near closing time, but instead claimed he left fairly early, possibly before the diner finished cleaning, directly contradicting both his previous statement and staff accounts of seeing him in the kitchen while Elsie prepared to leave. When Huxley reminded him of his earlier claim that he signed for the delivery and left immediately afterward, Booker grew flustered, saying he didn't remember exactly because of the heavy snow. His mind focused on the next delivery, and he wasn't watching the clock. However, this shift made the unexplained gap in his timeline even more noticeable. Huxley pressed further about Booker's position in the kitchen and hallway during the final minutes before leaving. This time, Booker said he might have walked toward the back door area to set down a crate, whereas previously, he insisted he only stayed near the shelves and never went deeper into that zone. When asked why such a critical detail changed, Booker replied that everything happened fast and I don't remember every step. This vagueness led Huxley to note that Booker was revising his account in ways increasingly difficult to verify. Huxley drilled down into the 5 to 10 minute gap Booker could not explain in the first interview. When asked again, Booker suggested he might have talked longer with Curtis in the kitchen than he recalled, or possibly stepped out to his truck and returned because he forgot to sign paperwork. But then immediately backtracked, saying he wasn't sure. This created another contradiction because Curtis never mentioned a lengthy conversation, and no witness saw Booker leave and return. Huxley asked whether Booker might have gone to the back door to look for someone or to smoke. Booker denied it, but his tone was less firm than before. This was a marked change from the first interview when he strongly denied approaching the back door. Huxley then introduced the truck driver's sighting of 2 figures behind the diner and asked whether Booker had been standing in that area when the truck passed. Booker immediately denied seeing the truck or being in the back lot, yet added that, "Maybe I was near the back door but didn't go outside," a completely new detail contradicting his initial firm denial of being anywhere near that area. When asked why his story kept changing, Booker claimed he was simply remembering things more clearly after thinking about it, but the explanation rang hollow because the changes occurred precisely at the timeline's most sensitive points. Huxley continued probing Booker's state of mind that night at the diner. Booker said he wasn't paying much attention to anyone, yet when asked why he clearly remembered signing for the delivery, but not the time he left, Booker had no answer. This deepened doubts about consistency. Additionally, when Huxley asked Booker to describe the last time he saw Elsie in the kitchen, Booker no longer said she was busily cleaning, but instead claimed he only saw her from a distance and didn't know what she was doing. Huxley immediately noted that Booker was minimizing his contact with the victim, possibly to distance himself from the final minutes before she left. As the interview wore on, Booker grew increasingly tense and began giving short, evasive answers to questions directly tied to his whereabouts during the critical window. Huxley asked once more, "Where were you in the 10 minutes after signing?" Booker replied that he couldn't remember at all, and ultimately insisted only that he left the diner before anything happened to the victim, despite no testimony supporting that claim. By the end of the session, Huxley concluded that Booker's statement had not only shifted from the first interview, but created new gaps in the timeline. The points Booker could not clarify: his location in the kitchen, the exact time he left, and the possibility of being near the back door, remained entirely vague. Booker's changing story led Huxley to note a significant drop in this witness's credibility, and the unverified time periods continued to represent a murky and potentially critical element in determining the victim's final minutes before she vanished. Sheriff Alvin Huxley, after working a second time with Raymond Booker and noting numerous new inconsistencies that had emerged, decided to go back and thoroughly re-examine all information related to the brothers Frank and Curtis Dalca, the 2 individuals who directly managed the Maple Ark Diner during the victim's final shift. Although there was still no concrete evidence to place them in the position of suspects, the inconsistencies in their statements and their roles at the scene forced Huxley to closely scrutinize both men's schedules and activities on the evening the victim disappeared. He began by cross-referencing the times Frank and Curtis claimed they finished closing the diner. Frank insisted that the place had been cleaned and locked up almost immediately after the last customer left. Curtis, however, described the cleanup as taking longer, that there were still some tasks in the kitchen to finish, and that Elsie had left later than Frank's account suggested. When Huxley placed the two statements side by side, he realized the time discrepancy between the brothers ranged from 10 to 15 minutes, a significant gap in a case where the entire sequence of events surrounding the victim unfolded in a very narrow window before she vanished completely. Moving beyond the timeline, Huxley examined each man's position inside the diner. Frank stated he had mostly stayed at the cash register area, checking the books and shutting down equipment before leaving. Curtis said he had moved back and forth between the kitchen and the storage area while handling some post-shift items. Yet neither statement clearly established the exact whereabouts of the brothers during the final minutes when the victim left the kitchen and hallway area. This led Huxley to note that there was no evidence, apart from their own words, to confirm that either Frank or Curtis was not near the back door at the moment the incident occurred. Additionally, Huxley reviewed the brothers' personal schedules and working relationship. Frank, as general manager and co-owner, handled the register and overall business operations. Curtis primarily ran the night shift, overseeing the kitchen and inventory. Huxley checked work notes and delivery invoices to cross-reference their statements, but the diner's lax record-keeping made everything difficult to verify. For example, Frank said he reviewed the books at the end of the shift, yet there were no timestamps to confirm exactly when he did so. Similarly, Curtis claimed he recounted tools and supplies in the kitchen, but no notes substantiated this. When Huxley examined delivery invoices related to Booker, he found no notations indicating which brother had signed for them or at what time. This contributed to the Dalca brothers' timeline being just as vague as Booker's. Huxley returned to the contradictions in the brothers' initial statements. Frank said Elsie left the diner normally and showed no signs of distress. Curtis, in contrast, said she had been quiet and appeared anxious. This difference could not be ignored because it concerned the victim's state of mind just before her disappearance. However, no witness fully corroborated either version. Some said the victim seemed normal, others said she seemed off. Huxley noted the contradiction, but had no basis to determine whether one of them was simply misremembering or concealing something. Furthermore, Curtis's claim that he heard a faint noise from the back of the kitchen, while Frank flatly denied hearing anything, was another point. Huxley flagged. If a noise had occurred, it could relate to the victim's movements or someone else's. But since no one else confirmed it, the sound remained vague and unusable as solid investigative data. Huxley also checked the brothers' personal schedules the following day to see whether they had come in that morning. Both said they arrived as usual, but neither had independent evidence to confirm it. The fact that the two men jointly ran the diner and had access to nearly every area inside it made Huxley realize that if anything had happened inside the building, the Dalca brothers were among the very few who knew every hidden corner. Still, the lack of concrete evidence prevented him from conducting deeper interrogations or treating them as official suspects. When Huxley considered requesting a warrant to search the storage shed out back, or the brothers' private storage areas, he had to abandon the idea because the case was still only a missing person report, not a criminal investigation. There were no clear signs the victim had been harmed inside the diner, so he could not justify a warrant to search the owner's private property. The legal limitations of 1960, combined with physical evidence that had been almost entirely erased by weather, tightly constrained every decision he could make. In the end, Huxley documented all the contradictions and gaps in the Dalca brothers' statements, but had to conclude there was insufficient basis to treat them as subjects requiring further investigation. The Dalca brothers were temporarily removed from the priority list, even though the inconsistent details suggested many questions remained unanswered, and that ambiguity continued to create a major hole in the early stages of the investigation. Sheriff Alvin Huxley returned to his office at the end of the third day of searching, carrying a case file that was still only a few pages thick, a fact that underscored how seriously the initial investigation had stalled. He sat at his desk and reopened every note from the moment the family reported her missing to the final tracking efforts at West Rutland Marble Quarry, trying to organize everything they had gathered. But the more he reviewed, the more he saw how fragile the file was, the key points needed to reconstruct a timeline simply did not line up. Critical statements had shifted over time, and every investigative avenue ended with the same conclusion: no physical evidence, no trail of movement, no verifiable clue about which direction the victim had gone after leaving Maple Arch Diner. The preliminary police report at that stage only recorded time markers based on scattered statements. The victim left the diner near the end of the shift. A few witnesses saw a figure pass through the back door. Booker was in the kitchen but could not pinpoint exactly when he left. The Dalca brothers gave differing times for cleanup, and a red Chevrolet appeared, but no one could establish a connection. Not a single one of those data points was backed by physical evidence. The entire rear lot of the diner, the place most likely to preserve footprints, had been completely wiped clean by snow. The victim's route home, though thoroughly searched, yielded no sign she had ever walked it. Canine searches only provided an initial direction before quickly losing the scent at the edge of Green Mountain National Forest. Major natural sites like Chitten Reservoir or West Rutland Quarry turned up nothing. Every avenue considered most likely led to a dead end. Huxley compiled the report and saw that most leads had been left hanging or could not be pursued further. The truck driver's statement about two figures behind the diner was not included in the official report because it lacked verifiable details. Booker's statements contained too many contradictions, but no grounds for deeper interrogation. Frank and Curtis Dalca's statements showed multiple mismatches regarding timing and the victim's demeanor. But there was no physical evidence or additional witnesses to corroborate anything. Huxley understood that those contradictions, in the absence of supporting evidence, could not serve as a basis to escalate the case to a criminal investigation. Therefore, everything was recorded only in internal notes and not listed as official investigative leads. Areas with potential relevance, such as the storage shed behind the diner, were never searched, not because Huxley thought them unimportant, but because he could not overcome legal constraints to do so without clear signs of criminal activity. In the context of 1960, when investigative procedures still depended heavily on physical traces, witnesses, and direct observation, the complete absence of traces left the case virtually unable to move forward. The initial investigative report, which should have clearly outlined the chain of events, instead became a summary of disconnected fragments. The victim left the diner. No one knew where she went. There was no trace proving any specific direction of travel, and everyone present described events inconsistently or imprecisely. Looking at the entire file, Huxley had to acknowledge that no piece of data was strong enough to determine what had happened to Elsie Warren. No witness saw her after she walked out the back door. No one heard a cry for help or strange noise. None of her personal belongings were found. There were no signs of a struggle, no scratches, no footprints leading toward the woods or the main road. Everything stopped at unprovable speculation. All the initial investigation left behind were big questions with no answers. Where did Elsie go? Was she with someone? Were the two figures the truck driver saw relevant? Where exactly was Booker during the minutes he couldn't account for? Why did the Dalca brothers remember the final minutes of the shift differently? What did the red Chevrolet mean? And most importantly, why was there no trace at all in an area that should have preserved at least some small evidence? When Huxley closed the file, he knew the initial investigative phase had failed to achieve its most important goal, establishing a foundational direction to develop the case. The thin report, lack of evidence, murky timeline, and unconfirmed leads meant Elsie Warren's disappearance was at risk of falling into complete stagnation. He ended his summary with a short but heavy note: no basis for further investigation, case cannot progress. Sheriff Alvin Huxley reviewed the entire initial investigative report one last time before submitting it to the county office, and the conclusion reached after days of fruitless searching was there were no clear signs of criminal activity related to Elsie Warren's disappearance. Although numerous irregularities had been noted in witness statements and from those present at Maple Arch Diner that night, no physical evidence supported any specific investigative direction. No footprints, no personal belongings, no signs of struggle, no indication the victim had been coerced or taken against her will. Even the smaller leads, the red Chevrolet, the two figures the truck driver saw, the contradictions in Booker's and the Dalca brothers' statements, lacked sufficient basis to become official evidence because every element was missing independent verification. After an overall assessment, the sheriff's office concluded the case could only be classified as a missing person, cause undetermined, not yet meeting the criteria to become a criminal investigation. County procedure in 1960 stipulated that if a missing person case produced no additional leads within a set period and no evidence indicated criminality, the file would be moved to temporary storage pending new information. This was a procedural rule, but in Elsie Warren's case it meant the investigation essentially stopped completely. When the decision was announced, the Warren family protested strongly. They insisted Elsie would never leave home without telling anyone and had no reason to vanish suddenly. They demanded police expand the search area, continue questioning Booker, search the storage shed behind the diner, and track down the red Chevrolet. But when Huxley explained that all those avenues had already been considered within legal limits, there was no legal basis to search private property, no traces to continue searching, no evidence to justify deeper interrogation. The family could only repeat that something definitely happened without being able to provide any additional information. In the end, despite the family's understandable outrage, police could not expand an investigation based solely on feelings or general suspicion. Having only contradictory statements without supporting evidence meant the case did not meet the criteria to remain active. After nearly 2 weeks from the initial report, the official file was closed and transferred to Rutland County Storage under the code Missing Person, Unresolved, with a brief note: no clear signs of criminal activity, no additional data. When the box was placed on the cold wooden shelf, everything related to Elsie Warren's disappearance stopped there. A thin report, a few pages of scattered notes, and not a single piece of physical evidence. The family left the sheriff's station in silence, unable to accept that a person could vanish in the middle of a small town without leaving any trace. But with what had been collected, police had no further direction to pursue, and so Elsie Warren's file entered the long sleep of an unsolved missing person case, buried in silence, just like the snow that had erased every trace of her on that first winter night of 1960. Once the file was archived and the official investigation halted, Elsie Warren's disappearance began to take on a different shape. A chain of rumors, whispers, and growing suspicion that gradually spread through the Rutland community, where everyone knew one another and believed a 17-year-old girl could not vanish in absolute silence without human involvement. Only weeks after police announced they found no signs of foul play, an unofficial list of 3 names began circulating in conversations at the diner, the general store, and the church queue. The Dalca brothers, who managed Maple Ark Diner the night it happened; Raymond Booker, the delivery man, whose statements kept changing; and the man driving the red Chevrolet, whose identity no one in town knew and whose reason for being near the diner that night remained unexplained. Frank and Curtis Dalca were the first to come under suspicion because they were directly responsible for the diner, were present throughout the victim's final shift, and no one else knew every nook and cranny of Maple Ark Diner as well as they did. Some residents pointed out that the brothers' statements didn't match, that they had rushed to close up, and that they seemed too calm once someone was reported missing. The difference in how they described Elsie's mood that night, Frank saying she was fine, Curtis saying she seemed tense, became fodder for many to believe at least one of them knew more than he was telling. Even though police had no evidence to investigate further, public opinion kept their names on the suspect list. The second name was Raymond Booker, whose inconsistent statements were obvious even to people who knew nothing about investigations. The story of the 5 to 10 minute gap he couldn't explain spread through the community like an unavoidable hole. Some said they had seen Booker acting irritable in the diner in the days before. Others said he often hung around behind the diner to smoke. No one knew which details were accurate, but every small anecdote was exaggerated and tied to Booker having something to do with the night the girl disappeared. The third name, the mysterious driver of the red Chevrolet, became the focus of every suspicious stranger story. In a small town where everyone recognized everyone else's car, a newer model Chevrolet, appearing in a low-traffic area on the exact night of the disappearance, struck many as more than coincidence. But because no one wrote down the license plate and no one approached the car or driver, the driver's identity remained the biggest blank in the entire case. From there, stories about the car multiplied. Some claimed they had seen the red Chevy parked near a vacant lot a few days earlier. Others said they heard the truck driver saw the car speed away right after a noise. Still others insisted the car belonged to a newcomer who had recently arrived in town but suddenly vanished after that night. Every story was just hearsay with no proof. Yet gradually, the three names, Dalca, Booker, and the Chevy driver, became the three directions in which public suspicion was evenly divided. However, despite how widely the rumors spread, no new hard information ever surfaced to confirm or refute any of the suspicions. Time passed, snow melted and fell again, winter gave way to spring, but Elsie's disappearance saw no progress. Authorities could not reopen the file without evidence. The community could not produce a concrete explanation, and the Warren family, though they kept searching, could not uncover a single clue in a town whose every corner was too familiar, yet held nothing they needed. When summer arrived, life in Rutland returned to normal, and talk about the disappearance gradually faded. People went back to their daily routines, and although the unofficial list of 3 suspects still lingered quietly in many minds, no one had reason or evidence to take another step. The case sank slowly, as silently as it had begun. On a freezing night in 1960, when the last trace of a 17-year-old girl was erased by snow in just a few hours, the Maple Ark Diner continued operating for many years after Elsie Warren's disappearance. But the lingering bad reputation in the community and the never-ending rumors gradually drove customers away. By 1984, after more than 2 decades of struggling to stay afloat amid financial ruin, the Dalca brothers were forced to close it for good. There was no farewell party, no long announcement, just a closed sign hung up one autumn morning, and the wooden door that had once welcomed countless busy evenings shut forever. When the Dalcas sold off most of the interior furnishings, buyers were mainly interested in the kitchen equipment, tables, and whatever else was still usable. The main building itself, already badly deteriorated from decades of harsh Vermont winters, held no appeal for renovation or reopening due to its secluded location and low profit potential. Within just a few months of the diner shutting down, dust coated the counter, the wooden floor began to rot, and the windows fogged over with condensation from inside. The back lot, the focal point of every rumor tied to the 1960 disappearance, became utterly desolate. No more employees' footsteps, no more daily trash pickups, no more Booker passing through on his delivery route. Instead, weeds grew tall through cracks that had once been covered in snow. The wooden fence rotted and leaned, and the small storage shed in the corner remained locked with the same old chain that no one could remember putting there. After the diner closed, no organization or business wanted to lease the property. It sat in an in-between zone, not far enough out to serve as a roadside stop on the main highway, yet not close enough to town to be convenient for locals. On top of that, the old Maple Ark Diner building carried an unexplained heavy atmosphere. Some people said that the moment you stepped inside, a chill clung to your skin, as if the place had never left the winter of 1960. By the late 1980s, the town classified the building as an abandoned structure, but never demolished it because it remained privately owned. Each winter, the old tin roof sagged further under the weight of snow. Each summer, more paint peeled away. The once brightly lit Maple Ark Diner sign was reduced to a rusted metal frame. The back lot, once cleaned daily, became a mess of rotting leaves, broken stones, and layered traces of time. Only neighborhood kids occasionally dared to climb the fence to explore, but most ran off after a few minutes because of the weird feeling, describing it as though something was watching them from inside. Adults avoided even mentioning the place, not because they believed in ghosts, but because the crumbling building had become a symbol of a story that was never solved. Over time, the Maple Ark Diner was no longer seen as just an old restaurant. It became a void left behind in Rutland, a place everyone wished they could forget, yet no one truly could. And throughout all those years, the back lot remained exactly as it had been on that first winter night in 1960, silent, empty of people, and still carrying the unanswered question. 48 years after the Maple Ark Diner closed and Elsie Warren's disappearance faded into obscurity, something completely unexpected happened inside the Rutland County Records storage room, where old files were stacked on faded wooden shelves. In January 2012, while cleaning and reorganizing boxes of documents from the 1950s through the 1970s, a new county archivist discovered an old envelope jammed between two unrelated case folders, nearly hidden under thick dust. The pale yellow envelope wasn't listed in any catalog. It had no file number, no stamp, no internal code. The only thing written on the outside was a scrawled line in faded blue ink. To Rutland Police. Urgent. At first glance, the handwriting seemed ordinary, but the archivist noticed the ink style matched documents from the 1960s. When he opened it, inside was a single folded sheet, yellowed and brittle at the edges, clearly written decades earlier. The date in the corner, February 26, 1961, made him immediately take the document to his supervisor for verification. And with just the first 3 sentences of the letter, more than half a century of silence was shattered. The anonymous author claimed to know what happened behind the diner the night the girl disappeared. There was no sender's name, no signature, but the content was too direct to ignore. The writer stated they had seen something wrong in the area behind the Maple Ark Diner on that December night in 1960, that someone dragged something toward the small shed, and that everyone thought she went home, but that's not what happened. The letter described the events in a tone that was both terrified and haunted, as if the author had carried the memory for months before finally deciding to send it. Even more disturbing was a line in the middle. If I had spoken up then, they would have found whatever is there now, that probably can't even be recognized anymore. Though the language and handwriting didn't suggest a highly educated person, the word choices made the letter feel heavy and convincing, as though the writer had truly witnessed something. Yet the tone also revealed fear of getting involved, fear of retaliation, or simply being too traumatized to come forward. The archivist turned the letter, envelope, and a note about where it was found over to his supervisor. When the file reached the Rutland Police Department, the records unit captain immediately cross-referenced the date with county history and realized the letter had been written just 2 months after the disappearance case was closed in 1960. This raised immediate questions: why wasn't such a crucial document in the official file, and why had it been wedged between unrelated folders as if it had never been properly submitted? Upon examining the handwriting, investigators saw that the letter had never been logged, never stamped as received, meaning it likely never reached police hands in 1961. It could have been lost in the mail, misplaced in internal files, or deliberately put in the wrong place without leaving a trace. No one knew what had happened, but one thing was certain: the letter's contents had never been used in the investigation. When the police department began an initial internal review, they recognized the seriousness of the content. If the letter was accurate, something that happened behind the diner could be directly tied to the victim's last known location and time. The phrase "dragged something toward the shed" especially caught their attention because the shed behind the Maple Ark Diner had been superficially checked by Sheriff Huxley in 1960, but never thoroughly searched due to lack of legal grounds. That the letter pinpointed that exact area at the exact time of the disappearance made it impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Current investigators immediately noted that the content was strong enough to be considered a new lead, even if the letter came from a frightened or mistaken witness. But what made the letter explosive wasn't its absolute accuracy, it was that it broke 52 years of legal silence. Under Vermont law in 2012, any new document related to an unsolved missing person case could trigger reopening the file if it suggested possible criminal conduct. The anonymous letter, though unsigned, described intentional actions, specified a location and behavior, and implied someone had hidden something near the diner. All of these factors met the criteria required to restart a long-closed case. There was no longer any doubt the letter lost since 1961 became the basis for police to formally request the Elsie Warren file be reopened. But the hardest thing for those who read the document to accept wasn't the suspicious content, it was a different question. How could such an important letter have been forgotten for nearly 5 decades in a storage room? And why had no one ever mentioned an anonymous letter arriving after the case was closed? There were no clear answers. No procedure existed to trace administrative errors from the 1960s, and no record showed the letter had ever been opened before. But one thing was certain, that old envelope, only just discovered in 2012, forced law enforcement to face a disappearance they thought time had buried. The letter was placed on the conference table, and with just a few lines of fading ink, the Elsie Warren case was officially reopened after 52 years of silence. Detective Nora Sheridan, with the Vermont State Police Major Crime Unit and Cold Case Team, received a copy of the anonymous letter along with the Elsie Warren disappearance file at the end of January 2012. After flipping through the first few pages, she immediately saw serious deficiencies in the entire original investigation. The file was shockingly thin for a missing teenager, and even more troubling after more than half a century, virtually no additional documents had been added over time. Nora set the folder on her desk, took off her glasses, folded her arms, and stared at the 1961 handwritten line, "I know what happened behind the diner." She understood that in 2012, a single sentence like that was enough to reactivate a cold case, but what interested her more was how perfectly it fit the vague spots in the original investigation, spots that had been ignored in 1960, but now stood out as signs something had been covered up. For the first 2 days, Nora read the entire file from cover to cover, taking notes on every detail, every timeline marker, every contradictory witness statement Sheriff Alvin Huxley had recorded. The deeper she went, the more stunned she was by the level of inconsistency, mismatched statements, timelines with no anchor points, suspicious witnesses never followed up on, and key areas completely overlooked. The fact that the shed behind the diner, now directly referenced in the newly discovered anonymous letter, had never been searched, made it, in Nora's view, the biggest failure of the entire old file. She also noted that every 1960 search effort had been at the mercy of the weather, and the weather had erased everything police might have relied on. This led Nora to conclude the case hadn't failed due to negligence, but because of the circumstances and investigative limitations of the era. Still, clear mistakes remained. Witnesses whose stories changed were never pressed. The red Chevrolet was never pursued, no evidence was ever collected from the diner, and above all, no detailed report was made of the back area, even though multiple people mentioned it, yet it was removed from the priority list. When she finished reading, Nora opened a private notebook and began a list of items that needed re-examination. She decided to approach the case as if it had just happened, completely independently, unswayed by the data-lacking conclusions of 1960. In an internal meeting, Nora presented a list of 15 critical points to reopen, each directly tied to original investigative failures or prompted by the anonymous letter. 1. Re-examine the entire area behind the Maple Ark Diner, including the back lot, walkways, the old shed, and adjoining land. 2. Trace the shed's origin, ownership history, and who had keys in 1960. 3. Re-identify the owner of the red Chevrolet through 1959, 1961 county vehicle registration records. 4. Re-evaluate Booker's statement, cross-check it against all known facts from the time, and search records for any later criminal activity or relevant incidents involving him. 5. Reassess the Dalca brothers' statements, including financial history, employee relations, and any business conflicts at the time. 6. Reconstruct the timeline using modern methods and all witness descriptions to map probable movements inside and outside the diner. 7. Research the Green Mountain Forest area with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar, technology that did not exist in 1960. 8. Re-examine wells and rock areas of the West Rutland Marble Quarry, using modern imaging technology. 9. Cross-check 1960 Rutland census records for anyone who left town in the weeks following the disappearance. 10. Review all calls, anonymous letters, and citizen tips from 1960-1962 for anything previously overlooked. 11. Forensically analyze the anonymous letter, ink, paper, handwriting, linguistic traits to assess credibility. Reconstruct the diner layout to identify blind spots, unobserved areas, and secondary exits. 13. Verify the list of regular Maple Ark Diner customers from that period. 14. Check Rutland area crime records 3 years before and after the disappearance for similar behavioral patterns. 15. And most importantly, reanalyze the entire file from a fresh perspective to determine whether the victim's disappearance could be linked to someone who had access to her in her final minutes. When Nora finished presenting the list, the room fell silent. No one in the unit had ever imagined a 52-year-old case could contain so many errors. But Nora knew the case had only failed because everything had once been too murky, not because it was unsolvable. And now, with the anonymous letter appearing like a reminder from the past, she knew she had to see it through to the end. Detective Nora Sheridan immediately placed the land behind the Maple Ark Diner at the top of her priority list after reading the anonymous letter and comparing it to the 1960 investigative failures. A single sentence, "They dragged something toward the shed," was enough for her to conclude the area needed to be resurveyed with modern technology, especially ground-penetrating radar, GPR, to examine subsurface soil layers. On a late February morning in 2012, the Vermont State Police forensic geology team arrived at the abandoned property where the Maple Ark Diner once stood. The main building was in severe disrepair, and the back lot was overgrown with weeds, roots, rocks, and uneven ground from decades of neglect. But for Nora, that very abandonment was an advantage. The area had seen almost no human interference for decades, meaning any unusual soil disturbance was likely tied to something that happened in 1960. Before running equipment, the survey team cleared part of the surface, cutting low brush and removing seasonal debris. When the GPR unit was activated and pulled along the back wall of the old diner, the screen showed stable, even soil layers, straight flat lines indicating no disturbance for a long time. However, as the team moved closer to the old shed, the exact spot mentioned in the letter, the waveforms changed. Instead of smooth curves, the screen displayed anomalous signals, horizontal breaks, and an arc-shaped disturbance zone nearly 3 meters long. The GPR operator asked a rescan to rule out equipment error. The second and third scans produced the same results, a clear subsurface disturbance at a depth of about 80 to 90 centimeters. Unlike natural soil, the anomaly showed deliberate interference, digging, filling, or shifting of earth in a defined area. Nora watched the screen and noted immediately, disturbance lies directly along the line from the back door to the shed. That was the exact path mentioned in the letter, and the exact path the original investigation had never examined. After pinpointing the location, the team marked the area with wooden stakes and roped off a 2-meter radius to prevent further disturbance. Nora sent an urgent report to the county office requesting an excavation warrant. Because the case had been officially reopened, the warrant was approved the same day. That afternoon, while there was still daylight, the forensic team began removing the topsoil. The surface layer was only leaf litter and roots, but the second layer was darker than normal, a sign of past disturbance and refilling. Subsequent shovelfuls revealed inconsistent soil, some loose like fresh dirt, some unnaturally compacted. This further confirmed the area had been dug up and refilled decades earlier. At about 60 centimeters deep, a team member stopped and called Nora over. A large section of soil was brushed aside, revealing something ivory white mixed in the dark earth. When light hit it directly, the shape became clear. It was part of a human bone. The team immediately switched from shovels to finer tools, small brushes, hand trowels, and metal probes, to avoid damaging the structure. As more soil was removed, Additional bones appeared, connected to those beneath. There was no longer any doubt. This was part of a human skeleton. Nora crouched down and closely examined the excavation site. The bones were in an unnatural position, not aligned as in a proper burial, but twisted to one side, as if placed hastily and carelessly. One leg was folded under the body. The arms lay awkwardly at the sides. As digging continued, scraps of rotted fabric appeared, too decayed to identify color or material. A small metal object was also recovered at the same depth, possibly a clothing fastener, button, or part of a small accessory. Though it was too early to confirm identity, the location and burial depth indicated the skeleton had been underground for a very long time, entirely consistent with 1960. When the main skeletal frame was fully exposed, the forensic team made a preliminary assessment. The skeleton was nearly complete, showed no animal damage, and most crucially, was buried exactly along the path described in the anonymous letter. Nora stepped back, took a deep breath, and felt an almost tangible shift in the air. After more than half a century buried, the truth was finally emerging from the cold ground behind the Maple Ark Diner, right where the 1960 investigation had never looked, never dug, and never considered. And now, the bones of a human being were telling the story that the weather that year had erased from the surface. The bone sample recovered from the land behind Maple Ark Diner was transferred the same day to the Vermont State Police Forensic Laboratory in Burlington, where DNA analysis for cold cases is prioritized. Detective Nora Sheridan personally oversaw the intake process, requiring the chain of evidence to be sealed according to modern standards, a stark contrast to the rudimentary procedures of 1960, when the concept of DNA identification didn't even exist. As the forensic team began cleaning the bones, they used micro-sampling techniques from the femur and tibia, the densest structures least affected by decades of decay, to maximize the chances of recovering viable DNA. One section was thinly sliced and demineralized with solution to expose the inner bone tissue. The remainder was ground into fine powder inside a vacuum chamber to eliminate any contaminants. After more than half a century underground, the DNA had naturally degraded severely, but 2012 technology allowed scientists to extract and sequence the remaining nuclear and mitochondrial fragments with high accuracy. The sample went into the sequencer, undergoing multiple PCR amplification cycles to rebuild the broken strands. Technicians spent hours filtering out impurities before finally producing a comparable DNA profile. Meanwhile, Nora contacted the Warren family. The only surviving relative in the most recent generation was Elsie's niece, born years after the disappearance. The family agreed to provide a reference sample, a standard buccal swab collected and sent to the lab. Because the niece was a direct maternal descendant, mitochondrial DNA matching became the primary method to determine whether the remains were Elsie Warren's. When both samples were run through the comparison system, the genetic markers began to align. Each short sequence was checked against the reference. The initial matches made the technicians cautious but not ready to conclude. They ran deeper analysis, cross-checking surviving nuclear DNA loci for greater certainty. The final result, after 3 rounds of cross-verification and independent comparison by 2 separate teams, showed a near-perfect match with the Warren family sample. The forensic report stated clearly, the probability that these 2 samples do not share a maternal lineage is less than 1 in 10 million. That meant the skeleton excavated behind Maple Ark Diner was Elsie Warren, the woman who vanished on the first winter night of 1960. When Nora received the results, even though she had expected them, she still paused for several seconds to take a deep breath. More than 50 years, a length of time so great that a missing person case could become local legend, was now framed by one definitive conclusion. The victim had not run away, had not disappeared into the woods, had not gotten lost. She had been buried right behind the diner where she worked, in a spot where that year's snow had covered everything within the first few hours. Nora forwarded the forensic report to Vermont State Police headquarters, and within minutes, the case file status was updated. Victim identified, case reclassified, homicide. When the Warren family received the news, no one could speak for the first few minutes. They had waited more than half a century for an answer, but when it came, it carried a heavier truth than any theory they had ever imagined. The lab returned the evidence box to the investigative team. Inside were the reassembled bones laid out in anatomical order, accompanied by the identity confirmation report. Nora rested her hand on the edge of the box, not out of ritual or personal emotion, but because she understood that from this moment the case was no longer a mysterious disappearance, it had become a murder concealed for nearly 6 decades. And if the remains had been found exactly where the anonymous letter said they would be, someone in town had known the truth since 1961 and stayed silent for an entire lifetime. Detective Nora Sheridan, after receiving the DNA results confirming the skeleton behind Maple Ark Diner was Elsie Warren, immediately moved to the next phase, reconstructing the entire timeline using modern investigative standards. Her goal was clear: pinpoint the exact window when the victim was killed and buried, thereby narrowing the list of people who had the opportunity to commit the crime in that brief period. Nora began by dividing the 1960 data into 3 categories: statements about when the victim left the diner, statements about who else was present at that time, and peripheral data such as sightings of the red Chevrolet or noises behind the building. She then plotted everything onto a digital timeline using the unit's investigative software, color-coding each marker by reliability, something that simply did not exist in 1960. The most critical part of rebuilding the timeline was comparing those time markers to the location where the body was found. The skeleton lay less than 30 meters from the diner's back door, buried less than 1 meter deep, with clear signs of hasty amateur burial. This proved the victim was disposed of right there behind the diner, not transported elsewhere. More importantly, such a shallow grave indicated the killer had very little time and was likely operating under severe time pressure or limited conditions. From this, Nora concluded that the interval between Elsie leaving the diner and the body being buried had to be extremely narrow, and the disappearance occurred almost immediately after she stepped out the back door. Using the original data, Nora discarded every statement based on vague estimates and kept only markers tied directly to observed actions, locations, or eyewitness sightings. The result quickly revealed a crucial truth: almost every 1960 statement collapsed under modern scrutiny. Frank's claim that Elsie left almost right after finishing cleanup, and Curtis's claim that she stayed a few extra minutes differed by at least 10 minutes. But when cross-referenced with the burial location, Nora determined the burial had to occur before heavy snow resumed that night. The soil stratigraphy showed the disturbed earth matched recorded snowfall levels from 1960 weather logs. Historical snowfall data showed accumulation increased sharply after roughly 11 p.m., meaning the burial had to happen before then. So the churned soil could be naturally covered within hours. That placed anyone behind the diner after approximately 10:45 p.m. inside the viable window for committing the crime. The truck driver's statement about seeing 2 figures behind the diner, previously excluded from the official 1960 report, suddenly became critically important. Nora calculated that if the driver passed between 10:15 and 10:40, it aligned perfectly with the burial window. The statement could not be dismissed. She added second figure to the timeline as a variable requiring verification. Next, Nora examined Booker's statements. In his first interview, he said he left near closing time. In the second, he said pretty early. When compared to the reconstructed timeline, both versions could not be true simultaneously. Booker's statements did not fit the burial location data. If he left before 10 o'clock, he was outside the suspect window. But if he left after 10:30, as a waitress later recalled, then he was squarely inside it. Nora flagged both statements as inconsistent indications of deliberate falsehood. She then reviewed the Dalca brothers' statements. Frank claimed he heard nothing behind the diner. Curtis claimed he heard a vague noise but didn't check. With the new burial location data, Nora found this implausible, digging a nearly 1-meter hole in early winter frozen ground, in a short time would have made considerable noise. She marked the brothers' silence as the first major anomaly among the last people at the scene. When all old and new data were plotted on the same timeline, most of the 1960 timeline had to be discarded for lack of precision. What remained was a short, sharp sequence of events. Elsie exited through the back door. Heavy snow began shortly afterward. A narrow 10:45 p.m. window was the only period the body could have been buried without leaving traces after the heavy snowfall. And within that window only 3 parties were present: Booker, the Dalca brothers, and the still unidentified driver of the red Chevrolet. When Nora connected the dots, one thing became clear: the victim's disappearance was not random. It happened in a time frame so tight that only people already behind the diner could have committed the crime. The new timeline was unambiguous. The killer acted fast, never moved the victim far, disposed of the body on the diner's own back lot, and relied on the snowfall to conceal everything. Nora stood before the digital timeline board, taking in the new structure. For the first time in 52 years, the case was no longer a vague, disconnected series of events. It had shape, precise timestamps, and a suspect pool narrowed to the absolute minimum. The people who were in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, during the window, the truth had been buried under snow for half a century. Detective Nora Sheridan launched the next phase immediately after completing the modern timeline, re-interviewing every living witness from 2012, including former Maple Ark Diner employees, customers present that night, nearby residents, and especially the truck driver who reported seeing 2 figures behind the diner, but whose statement never made the 1960 file. Unlike the original investigation, Nora did not simply re-ask the recorded details. She probed for overlooked memories, things witnesses had thought unimportant or irrelevant at the time. When these now elderly witnesses were questioned in light of the confirmed homicide, many suddenly recalled details they had previously ignored or been afraid to mention. The first witness Nora tracked down was a woman who had been sitting by the back window that night. In 1960, she only said she saw the back door open once. In 2012, she added that a few minutes later, she heard a loud, unusual thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. When Nora asked why she never reported it, the woman explained that the howling wind and snow pelting the tin roof made her assume it was just equipment falling or a trash can tipping over. But now, knowing the body was buried out back, she was certain that sound was not accidental. A second witness, a man who lived beside the vacant lot behind the diner in 1960, said he saw Frank Dalca turn on the backyard floodlight near closing time, a detail never previously recorded. The light stayed on only seconds, but he remembered it clearly because the back lot rarely had light, and the floodlight was usually used only for taking out trash or retrieving supplies. Nora immediately flagged this on the new timeline. A light turned on during the exact burial window could indicate Dalca's presence exactly where the anonymous letter said. Next, Nora re-interviewed the truck driver, who saw 2 figures when his headlights briefly swept the area. In 1960, his statement was dismissed as unreliable. In 2012, he offered a new detail. He believed the closer figure was bent over the ground, while the second stood a few steps away, as if watching or waiting. That posture matched digging or filling dirt. He also recalled the taller figure near the wall, matched Frank Dalca's recorded height from 1960. When Nora asked why he hadn't mentioned the bending posture earlier, he replied, "I wasn't sure then, and the police never followed up." Nora then located 2 former diner employees who had left Rutland shortly after the 1960s. One recalled that on Elsie's last night, Curtis Dalca was in and out of the kitchen more than usual and disappeared from sight for 5 to 10 minutes, exactly the unexplained gap from the original investigation. When asked why she never mentioned it, the woman hesitated and admitted she had been young and afraid to accuse the owners. Nora immediately red-flagged Curtis. He had claimed he stayed in the kitchen cleaning the whole time, yet a coworker placed him missing during the probable burial window. Another elderly witness who worked near the parking lot remembered the red Chevrolet not appearing just once as originally reported. He saw it twice that night. Once before the heavy snow, and again right before he left the area. The second sighting came minutes after he heard an odd sound behind the diner, like dirt being shoveled or tamped down. This matched the theory that the car may have been used to bring someone to or from the scene after the attack. Nora also spoke with a former customer who left shortly before Elsie went out back. He recalled an unusually tense atmosphere in the kitchen and remembered Curtis slamming a metal cabinet harder than normal. He had thought Curtis was just angry about the long shift, but in hindsight believed Curtis was trying to hide something. Moments after the slam, the customer heard a small but sharp metallic clank from behind the building. A neighbor who lived near the back alley confirmed hearing heavy footsteps going toward the storage shed and back, but the storm was so loud she couldn't be sure who it was. She was certain, however, that the footsteps didn't sound like a young woman's. They were loud and deliberate, like men's boots. All these small details, unusual noises, the backyard light switching on, the red Chevrolet appearing twice, and especially the Dalcas being near the back door during the burial window, when Nora added them to the modern timeline, aligned terrifyingly with the process of concealing a body. For the first time in 52 years, a clear picture emerged of what happened behind Maple Arch Diner, not a mysterious disappearance, not a girl swallowed by a snowy night, but a frantic, hurried burial. Carried out immediately after the victim vanished, and precisely during the minutes witnesses heard strange sounds. With every interview, Nora became more certain the burial could not have been the work of a passing stranger. It required familiarity with the layout, the ability to move in darkness behind the building, and above all, confidence no one would check that spot. Everything pointed not to an outsider, but to someone who belonged to Maple Arch Diner. Detective Nora Sheridan decided the moment was right to confront Raymond Booker directly, the man who had evaded, contradicted, and danced around the truth for more than half a century. But unlike 1960, in 2012, Booker was no longer a young night shift worker. He was 78, living alone in a small house south of Rutland, carrying a lifetime of unspoken torment. When Nora entered his quiet living room, she immediately recognized the guarded posture of someone who has kept a secret too long, wanting to speak yet terrified of his own words. After brief pleasantries, Nora placed the old case file on the table, then laid the DNA results confirming the skeleton behind Maple Arch Diner was Elsie Warren. "Mr. Booker, this is no longer a missing person case," she said. "It's a homicide, and you are one of the few people still alive who knows what happened that night." Booker did not react immediately. He stared out the window as if weighing whether to stand up and walk away. After several seconds he sat back down, hands trembling slightly on his knees. Nora began by asking him to recount his entire movements on the night of December 12, 1960. This time, instead of the rushed answers of past interviews, Booker closed his eyes for a moment and spoke, slowly, haltingly, but more coherently than ever before. He explained he arrived at the diner later than usual because heavy snow had caused his delivery truck to slide on a hill near downtown Rutland. He brought the crates into the kitchen and waited for Curtis Dalca to sign. But what Booker said next made Nora sit up straight. He admitted that after signing, he did not leave immediately, as he had always claimed. Instead, he stepped out the back door to smoke, a complete reversal of his previous statements that he never went near the back door. He said he hid the truth because he didn't want to be connected to anything that happened out back. When Nora asked why he was so afraid of admitting something as simple as smoking outside, Booker looked her in the eye for the first time. "Because that night, I saw something I wasn't supposed to see," he said. After that sentence, his breathing grew heavy, as if deciding whether to continue would alter the rest of his life. But he went on. He admitted that while standing just inside the cracked back door, shielded from the wind, he saw Frank Dalca outside, exactly where the anonymous letter later described. Frank didn't know Booker was watching, because Booker had only opened the door a sliver. He saw Frank bent over, pulling or pushing something heavy. When Nora asked if Frank was alone, Booker said he wasn't sure, but he heard another set of footsteps moving nearby. Heavy male steps, not a woman's shoes. Booker continued, right after seeing Frank bent over, he heard a sound like dirt being shoveled or tamped down. I didn't know what it was then, he said, but now I know I heard someone being buried. Nora wrote down every word. When she asked why he never told police in 1960, Booker's hands shook as he answered that he was terrified, not of the police, but of the Dalcas. Frank was known for his temper and had threatened employees who crossed him. He once said anyone who went against him would regret it for the rest of their life, Booker recalled. That night, when I saw him out back, I knew the smartest thing was to pretend I saw nothing. Nora pressed on the timeline. Booker no longer dodged. He confirmed that after seeing Frank, he froze inside the kitchen for several minutes, waiting until Frank was gone before daring to leave through the front. This directly explained the unexplained gap in his previous statements that fell precisely inside Nora's burial window. I didn't want to be involved, he repeated. I just wanted to get out of there. When Nora asked if he saw Elsie after leaving the kitchen, Booker shook his head. No, but he had heard something soft hitting the ground just before Frank appeared. That detail convinced Nora that Booker had heard Elsie's body being dragged or dropped. Regarding Curtis, Booker said Curtis also stepped toward the back door briefly, but Booker didn't know why. However, Booker was clear. Frank was the one he saw working the ground. Curtis just hung around the kitchen, he said. But Frank was out there. Nora shifted to the red Chevrolet. Booker hesitated, then admitted he had seen it, but stayed quiet in 1960 because acknowledging the car would force him to explain why he was at the back door. He said the car was parked exactly where witnesses described. Headlights dim as if recently turned off. When Nora asked if Frank approached the car, Booker recalled hearing an engine start shortly after Frank came back inside. But I didn't dare look, he said. I just wanted to leave. That statement confirmed for Nora that Booker was not merely a key witness. He was the last living person who knew exactly where Frank Dalca was and what he was doing during the minutes Elsie Warren's body was buried. At the end of the interview, Booker leaned back in his chair, exhausted but visibly lighter. When Nora asked her final question, why decide to tell the truth today? Booker was silent for a long time before answering softly, because she lay under that ground for more than 50 years, and I'm the only one still alive who knows it wasn't an accident. When Nora stepped out of the small house, wind whipped through the bare branches, and for the first time in the case, the truth was no longer buried under snow. Detective Nora Sheridan completely shifted her focus to Frank Dalca immediately after obtaining the new statement from Raymond Booker, because every piece of information that had just been revealed pointed to a single conclusion. Frank was behind the Maple Ark Diner at the exact time the victim was killed and buried. However, to turn that statement into investigative evidence, Nora needed to build a logical system based on the remaining objective data, including financial records, vehicle activity, travel routes, additional witnesses, and hard timestamps that Dalca could not explain away with words alone. The first thing Nora did was request the complete financial records of the Maple Ark Diner for 1960, a volume of documents that had never before been analyzed from a criminal investigation perspective. From the invoices, delivery receipts, timesheets, cash receipts, and supplier ledgers, Nora discovered one thing. Dalca had lied in 1960 when he claimed he was at the cash register, the entire time the diner was being cleaned. The cash register records showed the till was closed out at 9:45 p.m. Not close to 10:30 as Frank had stated. This proved Frank left the register area much earlier than his original statement indicated. Cross-checking the delivery records, Nora further discovered that the receipt Booker signed had actually been re-signed by Curtis after the delivery time, meaning Frank's entire claim that he finished work in the kitchen and left the diner right after the delivery was completed was completely false. There was no evidence Frank was even in the register area during the time frame he described. Nora noted Frank had no documented alibi for any moment between 9:50 p.m. and 10:45 p.m., the window established as the time of death and burial. Next, Nora ordered a search of Rutland vehicle registration records from 1959, 1961 to track down the mysterious red Chevrolet. Although the exact license plate could not be determined, Nora narrowed it down to 3 Chevrolets of the same year and similar color within a 15-mile radius of the Maple Ark Diner. Of the 3 owners, 1 vehicle belonged to Frank Dalca, registered in 1958, dark red. This was a fact that had never been investigated in 1960. When Nora compared it to his old statement, Frank had insisted he did not drive to the diner that night, a claim that was now an outright lie. When Nora re-interviewed a witness who had seen a red Chevrolet parked in the lot behind the diner that night, the woman confirmed the car she saw had a silver stripe along the door edge, exactly matching the trim on the 1958 model Frank owned. This led Nora to conclude there was a very high probability the red Chevrolet was Frank's. To strengthen the case further, Nora pulled county vehicle maintenance records and discovered Frank's red Chevrolet had been repaired in January 1961 for severe scratching on the undercarriage caused by striking a hard object. The repair document specified the scratches were on the rear axle, consistent with the direction the car had been seen parked that night, nose facing the diner, tail facing the dirt lot. The logic was clear: if the car had been backed into soft dirt or rocks, the undercarriage could easily have been scraped. Nora flagged this as circumstantial evidence supporting Frank's presence in the back lot that night. From there, Nora re-examined Frank's 1960 statement. He had claimed he never went out back because there was no reason to, yet every 2012 witness reported seeing light coming from the rear lot at the exact time Elsie disappeared, and that light could only be turned on from a switch inside the kitchen, an area Frank could reach in a few steps. When Nora reviewed the diner's floor plan, she realized that from the kitchen, Frank could reach the back door in 4-6 seconds, while the victim's disappearance and the perpetrator's cleanup all took place completely out of sight from anyone standing at the register. This directly contradicted Frank's old claim that he stayed at the register until he locked the door. Spatially and logically, that statement simply could not be true. When Nora checked historical weather records and compared them to the burial depth, she determined the perpetrator had to begin burying the body before 10:35 p.m. After that, snow fell so heavily that digging by hand would have been impossible. Thus, the killer had to be in the back lot before 10:30. When Nora compared all 1960 statements, only 2 people lacked an alibi before 10:30, Frank and Curtis Dalca. But thanks to Booker's 2012 statement, Curtis was only in the kitchen, while Frank was seen by Booker outside in the back, bent over the ground, dragging or pushing something. This left Nora concluding that Frank was the only person who fit the perpetrator's position in the critical time frame. Additionally, Booker's statement that he heard the sound of dirt being shoveled or tamped down matched the soil stratigraphy perfectly. The burial layer showed signs of being turned over and then covered with shallow soil, not deep soil. One key detail noted by forensics: the top layer of soil contained a mixture of cigarette ash, but the ash did not match Elsie's brand. It matched the brand Frank was known to smoke in 1960, according to former employees. When Nora checked the diner's purchase orders and Dalca's personal pharmacy receipts from that year, she confirmed Frank regularly bought the exact type of cigarette whose distinctive ash residue was found by forensics in the burial soil. This formed a complete logical chain. Frank was at the scene. Frank smoked at the burial site, and the presence of that ash matched the act of digging and covering. Finally, Nora examined the diner's payroll and expense ledgers. In the December 1960 expenditure book, she found a strange entry: payment for rear area cleanup service. No invoice, no name of the worker, no detailed reason. The payment was made one day after the victim disappeared. This was extremely strong logical evidence. When compared to Dalca's statement that nobody went out back, nothing was wrong. Nora confirmed the man had been lying from the very beginning, not just about his actions that night, but about everything related to the area where the crime occurred. combining all the data, vehicle history, financial records, demolished alibis, the rear yard light, soil disturbance evidence, cigarette ash, and the suspicious cleanup expenditure. Everything pointed inescapably to one conclusion: Frank Dalca was behind the diner at the exact moment the victim was killed and buried, and he attempted to cover his tracks within the first hours of the crime. Standing in front of the evidence board, for the first time in the entire investigation, logic and truth intersected at a single point. Frank Dalca was not merely an inconsistent witness, he was a systematic liar, and now the central suspect in a murder buried for more than half a century. The Vermont State Police forensics team continued excavating the area behind the Maple Ark Diner immediately after Elsie Warren's skeleton was identified, and the layers of soil gradually revealed a chain of physical evidence that no one in 1960 had expected. When Detective Nora Sheridan reviewed the forensic report, she realized the burial site contained far more than just bones. It held clear items directly tied to the Maple Ark Diner, and especially to Frank Dalca. While digging deeper around the edge of the grave, about 30 centimeters from the skeleton, the team uncovered a long, thin metal object coated in dirt and rust. At first it looked like an ordinary metal bar, but when preliminarily cleaned on site, the dirt fell away to reveal a rubber-coated head. The forensic technician immediately recognized it, a small rubber mallet, mainly used in kitchens for tapping barrel lids, fixing utensils, or securing cabinet pins. Notably, the Maple Ark Diner had been equipped with exactly this type of rubber mallet, according to the 1959 equipment inventory. Once the item was brought to the lab, the team examined the rubber structure and metal core. Although the tool was no longer functional, after more than 5 decades underground, certain features could still be analyzed, especially the impact patterns indented into the rubber face. The medical examiner compared those impact patterns to the fractures on Elsie's skull, a classic depressed fracture caused by a blunt object. The conclusion: the fracture lines were consistent with the contact surface of the rubber mallet found in the grave. It produced no sharp cuts, only cracks from heavy force, and a soft but weighted surface. The murder weapon was damaged, but sufficient to rule out other possibilities. This raised a critical question: why was a tool owned by the Maple Ark Diner buried in the same spot as the body? In the 1960 tool inventory, the rubber mallets were listed as all present, but no one had tracked the count on the night the victim disappeared. Thus, if the killer was someone inside the diner, they could easily have taken the mallet without anyone noticing. This further narrowed the suspect pool to those with access to the kitchen, Frank and Curtis Dalca, but only Frank was seen by Booker in the back lot at the crucial moment. In addition to the weapon, the diggers found a small, deteriorated piece of fabric lying directly beneath the soil layer where the skeleton's legs had been. The fragment was only about the size of 2 fingers, but the remaining weave and faded dark green color perfectly matched the aprons worn by Maple Ark Diner staff in 1960. When analyzed, scientists extracted a tiny amount of residual hemoglobin from the fibers, enough to confirm it was human blood. The DNA was too degraded for a full comparison, but the protein structure and blood type matched Elsie Warren's hospital records. Although not complete DNA evidence, the match in color, material, location, and blood made this fragment a vital link between the victim and the burial site. More importantly, when Nora compared photographs of the diner aprons from that year, one was missing a piece from the lower right edge, a tear documented in archived photos. This indirectly indicated the blood-stained fragment found in the grave had once been part of a staff apron or uniform. The apron did not belong to the victim. Elsie worked as a waitress, not in the cooking shift, and according to witnesses, that night Frank Dalca was the only person still wearing a green apron as the diner prepared to close. From there, Nora re-examined the role of the old storage shed. In the anonymous letter, the writer said, "They dragged something toward the shed." When the forensic team surveyed the ground next to the shed, they found traces of a heavy object having been dragged across the soil, distinct from the surrounding natural ground. Though faded by time, The compressed soil structure showed something had been pulled a short distance before stopping at the start of the grave. When Nora overlaid a scaled map on the scene, the drag path aligned perfectly with the route from the back door to the grave, straight, matching both the anonymous letter and Booker's new statement. Taken together, Nora now had 3 physical links: a murder weapon consistent with the skull fractures, a blood-stained fabric fragment matching a diner uniform, and drag marks leading directly from the back door to the burial pit. All of them fell within Frank Dalca's area of control. When Nora searched the remaining old diner tools kept by the current landowner, she found a 1960 green apron with a tear identical to the remaining portion of the fragment recovered from the grave. What caught her attention most was that this apron was not the type issued to waitstaff. It was the style reserved for managers or cooks, exactly the kind Frank wore when helping with end-of-day cleanup. At the same time, the lab reported another discovery: microscopic fabric impressions on the rubber surface of the mallet, consistent with the diner uniform material. The fabric marks showed the weapon had come into contact with either the victim's clothing or the attacker's clothing during the assault. In every line of analysis, the physical evidence circled back to the Maple Ark Diner and to Frank Dalca, the man who was in the back lot, who had access to the mallet, who wore the matching apron, and who had lied for 5 decades. When Nora pinned all these pieces to the investigation board, the structure of the crime became so clear it could not be explained any other way. The shed, the weapon, the blood-stained fabric, and the drag marks on the ground formed a continuous chain. The victim was struck with the rubber mallet, dragged from the back door toward the shed area, and hastily buried under shallow soil as snow began to fall and erase the traces. In a cold case spanning half a century, the emergence of physical evidence like this was not only sufficient to establish the act itself, but pointed directly to the one person still alive who was connected to it: Frank Dalca. An arrest warrant for Frank Dalca was signed on a late June morning in 2012 after federal prosecutors and Vermont police agreed that the chain of evidence from DNA, physical items, Booker's new testimony, GPR results, and the reconstructed timeline far exceeded reasonable doubt. When officers knocked on the door of the log house where Frank had lived since the Maple Ark Diner closed, he offered no resistance, but his face froze as if he had always known this moment would come. Frank was 81, white-haired and slow-moving, but that did not lighten the arrest. The image of him being handcuffed in his front yard was broadcast by Vermont media that same afternoon, marking the biggest turning point in a case more than half a century old. Immediately after Dalca's arrest, Raymond Booker formally agreed to testify as the key prosecution witness. He was placed in the state witness protection program, not out of fear of present-day retaliation, but because of his age and health. Authorities wanted to ensure he could give complete testimony at trial. In rehearsal sessions, Booker clearly described seeing Frank in the back lot, hearing the sound of dirt being shoveled and heavy thuds. Despite his age, his memory of that night remained so sharp that prosecutors considered it the most important witness piece in the entire case. Frank Dalca's trial took place at the Vermont Superior Court, Rutland County, in the fall of 2013. From the very first day, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, local residents, former Maple Ark Diner employees, and people who had lived through the original 1960 case. The atmosphere mixed long-suppressed anger with awakened skepticism. The prosecution opened by presenting the 2012 reconstructed timeline, showing the victim's disappearance window had been narrowed to under 30 minutes. In that window, only 3 people were present: Curtis Dalca, Booker, and Frank Dalca, but only Frank was in the exact location of the burial. The prosecution continued with the physical evidence: the rubber mallet buried with the skeleton, the blood-stained uniform fragment, cigarette ash matching Frank's brand, drag marks from the back door to the grave's edge, and the repair history of the red Chevrolet scratched in precisely the right spot. Forensic experts explained in detail that the fractures on Elsie's skull perfectly matched the shape of the rubber mallet's head, delivered from behind or the side, most likely near the back door or shed. They further proved the fabric fragment recovered from the grave was the missing piece torn from the type of apron issued only to kitchen managers, the type Frank alone wore that night as the diner closed. The courtroom fell so silent, you could hear pens scratching when the prosecutor displayed the GPR map showing the disturbed soil layer in a straight line between the back door and the shed, the exact path described in the 1961 anonymous letter. The letter, after ink and paper analysis, was confirmed to have been written in 1961, reinforcing that someone had known the truth but stayed silent for decades. When it was time for witnesses, Raymond Booker was called. He walked slowly, supported by an aide, but his voice was steady as he recounted the moment he saw Frank bent over the ground, the backyard light flashing on, and the heavy sound of something being dragged. The belated honesty, combined with the weary demeanor of a man who had carried a secret his whole life, had a powerful impact in the courtroom. Frank's defense attorney tried to argue that Booker's memory had degraded over time, that evidence degraded after 52 years was unreliable, and that no one directly saw Frank attack the victim. But the prosecution countered with the overall logic: only Frank had motive, opportunity, and control of the scene. Only Frank had access to the weapon and apron, and only Frank lied repeatedly about his whereabouts. The forensic expert concluded that the probability of all this evidence converging without Frank Dalca's involvement was virtually zero. After 3 weeks of trial, the jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned, the air in the courtroom was frozen. The foreperson stood and announced, "We find the defendant Frank Dalca guilty of second-degree murder." Frank lowered his head without reaction. Curtis Dalca, who had sat in the back throughout the trial, burst into tears the moment the verdict was read. Sentencing came a week later. Frank Dalca received 35 years in prison, the maximum allowable given his age, but reflecting the extreme gravity of the crime. At 81, the sentence amounted to life. As he was wheeled out of the courthouse, the crowd outside split into two reactions. One side applauded that justice had finally been served. The other stood silent, many unable to believe the man they had known in the Rutland community was a murderer. Some former diner employees were stunned. Some said they always suspected, others said they never thought Frank could do it. That division spread across the town. But of all the reactions, the most important came from the Warren family. Elsie's niece, who had never met her aunt, stood outside the courthouse after sentencing and said the family finally had answers. After 52 years, she said that although justice came too late to bring Elsie back, at least her disappearance was no longer a mystery buried under the snow. Those words silenced the entire courtroom. As dusk fell over Rutland that day, the townspeople felt as if a shadow that had hung over the place for half a century had finally lifted. The Elsie Warren case was closed, no longer a hopeless missing persons file, but a proper ending to a truth that had once been buried beneath the cold soil of a 1960 winter. The story of the Elsie Warren case, though set in 1960 Vermont, touches on issues that remain painfully relevant in American life today, from initial investigative failures and fear that silences witnesses, to the way a small community can be torn apart by rumor and lack of transparency. The most sobering warning is how the case was buried by what seemed like minor oversights. The back door was never thoroughly checked. The shed was ignored for lack of legal cause. Conflicting statements from Frank and Curtis Dalca were never cross-examined, and Raymond Booker stayed silent out of fear of retaliation. These details remind us that in modern life, indifference, avoidance, or reluctance to speak up can delay justice for decades. In today's United States, many cases are solved only when someone finally finds the courage to tell what they saw, whether it was an unusual sound, a light turning on at the wrong time, or a red car parked where it shouldn't be. The profound lesson here is that every small observation matters, and a community is only safe when every individual understands the value of truth. Another point worth reflecting on is how modern technology, from ground-penetrating radar and DNA analysis to advanced evidence examination, reopened a case everyone thought unsolvable. This reminds us to appreciate the role of forensic science in the American justice system, while also raising the question, how many other cases deserve to be re-examined in the light of today's technological advances? Finally, the divided reaction in Rutland when Frank was arrested shows that justice can sometimes wound collective memory, but it must still be done. The truth is not always easy to accept, but silence is far more dangerous. Elsie's story reminds us that justice may arrive late, but it should never be allowed to be forgotten. And the responsibility of every citizen is to protect the truth, even when it requires courage we didn't know we had. Thank you for joining us all the way to the conclusion of this case that lay buried for 52 years. If you'd like to keep exploring stories where justice rises from the darkness, please subscribe to the channel today. See you in the next video, where every mystery we unlock carries a reminder about truth. No matter how long it's been buried, it will eventually be found.